Her first words, according to the family members who remembered them, were, "Me, me." She was Bessie Wallis Warfield from Baltimore, and from the moment she understood that the world contained things she did not have, she devoted her life to obtaining them. She obtained a king. On December 11, 1936, King Edward V of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, Emperor of India, abdicated the most powerful throne in the world. He did it for a woman who had been married twice and who had, at the precise moment of the abdication announcement, been filmed at the window of Buckingham Palace, watching the proclamation of her lover's reign. News footage from that day, which was suppressed at the time because the British press was forbidden from showing it, captured her face in the window. She was grinning. One contemporary description called it the expression of a good-time girl who had just been given a new diamond. What she had actually just been given was considerably more complicated than a diamond, and considerably less than she thought. Here is what the people who actually knew Wallis Simpson said about her. Not the romanticized version of the tragic exile, not the sympathetic revision of the misunderstood American. The people who sat at her dinner table and watched her operate. Dr. Gaya Leinhardt was the stepdaughter of Cleveland Amory, who ghostwrote Wallis's memoir. She spent significant time with the Duchess. She said, "The Duchess was a complicated person, cold, mean-spirited, a bully, and a sadist." Cecil Beaton, the photographer and frequent houseguest, observed that Wallis ran her marriage like the management of a difficult child. The Duke of Windsor wrote to her in baby talk, "Viewy angui, your own little David is queeing so hard inside." Cecil Beaton also observed that she was nearly driven mad trying to find ways to amuse a man who had given up an empire and replaced it with nothing. Kenneth de Courcy, who moved in the Windsor's circle, described what she did to Edward in private. She went at him morning, noon and night, right up to 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, steaming up against his family. She went on and on and on and on. And then there was Joachim von Ribbentrop, the German ambassador who would later become Hitler's foreign minister and be hanged at Nuremberg. He sent Wallis 17 carnations every day while she was involved with Edward. The 17 was specific. It referred to the number of times they had slept together. The woman for whom a king gave up his throne was simultaneously conducting an affair with the man who would become the architect of the Holocaust, and she tried to flirt with Hitler at tea. This is not the love story. This is the story behind the love story, the formation that produced the grasping, the ruthlessness, the never satisfied, the woman whose first words were me, me, and who spent 90 years never getting enough of anything. She didn't want the crown. She never wanted to be queen. She wanted what she always wanted, which was the thing she didn't have. The moment she had it, she wanted the next thing. The next thing was always just out of reach. This is the real Wallis Simpson. Behind the palace doors, behind the diamonds, behind the abdication speech, behind the exile, behind the woman who made a king abandon an empire. Me, me. If you are enjoying this story so far, hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. There was no birth certificate. Bessie Wallis Warfield was born on the 19th of June, 1896, in a cottage at a resort hotel in Blue Ridge Summit, Pennsylvania, and no one filed the paperwork. This was not an administrative oversight. It was a management decision. Her parents had married in November 1895, which placed the conception of their daughter in approximately February of that year, which placed the conception before the marriage. In 1896, this was the kind of information that families managed through the mechanism of the not documented rather than the documented. The birth went unrecorded. The wedding date was adjusted in the family's account. Wallis herself, later, would tell people her parents had married in June 1895, which was a year earlier than they actually had, and which moved the conception to the comfortable zone of the fully married. She was lying about the circumstances of her birth from before she could speak. The lie was not hers. It was the family's management of the available information, but she absorbed it as the available management of the available information, and the absorption was the absorption of the person who learns early that the available information is the information that requires the management rather than the disclosure. Her father, Teakle Wallis Warfield, died of tuberculosis when she was 5 months old. She never knew him. He left nothing. He had been an unsuccessful businessman from a family of distinguished Southern stock, and the distinguished Southern stock had not produced in Teakle the commercial success that the distinguished Southern stock might otherwise have been expected to produce. He died, and he left his widow Alice and his infant daughter with the nothing that the unsuccessful businessman leaves when the unsuccessful businessman dies. The nothing required the management required the uncle. Solomon Davies Warfield was the successful member of the family that had produced the unsuccessful Teakle. He was a Baltimore banker and railroad entrepreneur who had founded the Seaboard Airline Railway and who was, by the standards of the Baltimore of the 1890s, extremely wealthy. He was also, by the accounts of the family members who described him afterward, capricious in the specific way that the wealthy uncle of the dependent niece is capricious, the wealth made available in the form of the provision that the provision's provider controlled rather than the provision's recipient. He paid for Wallis's education. The education was at Oldfield School in Glencoe, Maryland, which was the most expensive girls' school in the state. The most expensive girls' school in Maryland was the school that the wealthy uncle's provision made available for the daughter of the unsuccessful businessman who had left nothing. The school's expense was the uncle's provision. The provision was the uncle's. The uncle was not permanent. Philip Ziegler, whose authorized biography of Edward VIII remains the most meticulously researched account of the Windsor's world, assessed the specific effect of the formation on the person it produced. She spent her childhood in cheese-paring poverty, resentfully aware that her friends could afford nicer clothes and more lavish holidays. It seems reasonable to trace to this early deprivation the acquisitive streak which so strongly marked her character. The acquisitive streak. Ziegler is precise about the origin, not the greedy streak of the person who has always had enough and wants more. The acquisitive streak of the person who has been resentfully aware, across the years of the cheese-paring, that the world contains things she does not have. The resentful awareness is the formation. The resentful awareness teaches you something specific about the world. It teaches you that the world's distribution of its available things is not organized around your needs, and that the world requires active management rather than patient waiting. She managed it actively from the beginning. At Oldfield, she was known for her style and her wit, and her specific quality of the presence that demands the room's attention. She was not a beauty. This is the biographical fact about Wallis Simpson, that the romanticized account consistently softens. She had angular features and prominent bones, and a jaw that the camera made look masculine. She was not beautiful, she was magnetic. The magnetism was the active management of the available assets in the direction of the maximum available effect. The maximum available effect was the attention. The attention was what the cheese-paring poverty had taught her to require. Uncle Sol died when she was preparing for her debut season. He had been the provision. The provision had also been the caprice. In his will, he left his great fortune to various institutions, hospitals, charities, the Seaboard Airline Railway Employees' Pension Fund. To his niece Wallis, he left a monthly stipend of $60 a month. For the rest of his life, the man who had financed the most expensive girls' school in Maryland had produced $60 a month for the girl whose education he had financed. She had expected more. She had been resentfully aware across the years that the wealth was the uncle's wealth and not hers. When the uncle died, she expected the wealth to become more accessible. It became $60 a month. The resentful awareness that had been the formation of the cheese-paring years was confirmed by Uncle Sol's will in the specific form of the confirmation that the resentful awareness always produces when the available world confirms the resentful awareness by giving the resentfully aware person less than she expected. She married Win Spencer in 1916. Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. was a naval lieutenant and one of the first aviators in the U.S. Navy, which was, in 1916, the specific glamour of the person who is doing the new and dangerous thing that the era's glamour is organized around. He was handsome in the specific way that the aviation pioneer is handsome. She married him in November 1916. He was a sadistic alcoholic. The sadism and the alcoholism revealed themselves in the specific form that the sadism and the alcoholism of the person who concealed them during the courtship reveal themselves after the courtship, gradually, and then thoroughly, and then in the specific daily reality of the marriage to the sadistic alcoholic. He locked her in rooms. He humiliated her in front of their social circle. He drank. The drinking produced the humiliation. The humiliation confirmed the resentful awareness that the available world was not organized around her needs. She managed him by leaving him, repeatedly, in the specific form of the separation that the person who cannot yet divorce manages the marriage they have identified as unmanageable. The first formal separation was 1921. She agreed to rejoin him in China in 1924, in the specific calculation that the China posting might be the thing that repaired the marriage that the Washington posting had been unable to repair. China was not the repair. China was the education. The specific nature of the education that Wallis received in China is the dimension of her biography that the romanticized account has been most aggressive about, either dismissing or exaggerating, depending on the account's specific agenda. The exaggerated version involves elaborate sexual training in establishments whose existence was already largely mythological. The dismissive version insists that nothing of particular biographical significance occurred. The honest version, assembled from the available sources, is somewhere between the two. What is established is that Wallis had affairs in China. The Argentine diplomat was one. The Italian count, who later became Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and foreign minister, was another. The affairs were the affairs of the person who had married a sadistic alcoholic at 20, and who was managing the available options in the direction of the available satisfaction, when the available satisfaction was not available from the sadistic alcoholic who was also her husband. What is also established, or at least seriously claimed by multiple biographers without definitive refutation, is that Wallis underwent an abortion in China whose specific medical consequences included the damage to the reproductive system that left her infertile. The botched abortion thesis has been presented by several biographers including Charles Hyam, and has not been definitively established or definitively refuted. What is established is that Wallis and Edward had no children. What is established is that Wallis herself said she could not have children. The infertility's cause is the disputed dimension. There is also the intelligence dimension. American state files, as analyzed by the journalist Paul Foote, produced what he described as clear evidence that Wallis Spencer, as she then was hired as an agent for naval intelligence during her China period. The naval intelligence thesis is the thesis that has been presented with varying degrees of confidence by different sources and that has not been definitively confirmed or definitively dismissed by the available declassified material. What the China period definitively produced was the person who returned from it different from the person who had arrived. She arrived in China as the wife of the sadistic alcoholic managing the available options. She returned from China as the person who had learned, in the specific environment of Shanghai and the cosmopolitan colonial world of the 1920s Far East, specific things about the management of men and the available world's specific contents that the Baltimore and Washington and Pensacola years had not taught her. She divorced Spencer in 1927. She married Ernest Simpson in 1928. Ernest Simpson was the specific upgrade from Win Spencer that the upgrade represents when it is the specific upgrade from the sadistic alcoholic to the cultured, serious, solvent Anglo-American shipping heir who takes you to London. He was intelligent. He was kind. He was the steady provision that the uncle had withdrawn at $60 a month. Ernest was the available provision that required in exchange only the marriage and the social management of the household that Ernest wanted managed in the specific form of the well-run London household whose social circle Ernest wanted to inhabit. She managed it. The household at Bryanston Court was the household whose management Wallis applied the full force of the formation to. The specific management of the cheese-paring poverty's lesson that the available things require the active management rather than the passive waiting. The household was immaculate. The dinners were legendary. The guest lists were assembled with the specific intelligence of the person who understands that the available world's most significant resource is the access to the people who have the access to the other people who have the things that the available world makes available only to the people with the access. The access was what the London social world provided in the form of the dinner party circuit of the 1930s British upper class. The dinner party circuit was the circuit that the well-run household at Bryanston Court was organized around accessing. The accessing produced the guests. One of the guests, in January 1931, was the Prince of Wales. His name was David. His family called him David. The public called him Edward. History calls him Edward VIII. He was 36 years old, and the heir to the most significant throne available, and he was, by the accounts of the people who knew him at the time, a man whose specific emotional constitution had produced in him the specific need for the person who would manage him in the same way that the cheese-paring poverty had taught Wallis to manage everything. He was, as the historian Tracy Borman has described him, childlike when it came to women. He needed to be managed. He needed the management in the specific form of the person who would provide the structure that his formation had not provided, in the form of the loving authority, rather than the institutional authority that the monarchy and the palace and the court had provided as the available authority across his life. Wallis provided the structure. The structure was the structure of the person whose formation had been the formation of the active management of the available world. The active management of the available world was what she did. She did it to Edward. She did it to everyone she encountered. She did it to the household and the dinner party circuit and the London social world, and eventually to the British constitutional monarchy. The constitutional monarchy was the largest available thing. Me. The first words were the formation's statement of the formation's organizing principle. The organizing principle had organized the Baltimore years and the Oldfields years and the Win Spencer years and the China years and the Ernest Simpson years into the person who was now at dinner in the well-run Bryanston Court household in January 1931, meeting the heir to the British throne. The heir to the British throne was the largest available thing she had yet encountered. She encountered it. Edward had been the Prince of Wales since he was 16 years old. By the time Wallis Simpson sat across the dinner table from him at Bryanston Court in January 1931, he had been performing the specific function of the heir to the British throne for 22 years. 22 years of the speeches and the tours and the openings and the charitable occasions and the specific variety of the institutional presence that the heir to the British throne is required to perform as the heir to the British throne. He hated it. Not occasionally, not in the specific moments of the institutional fatigue that every person who performs the institutional function experiences in the specific moments of the fatigue. Consistently, across the 22 years, in the letters and the diaries and the private statements that the biographers have assembled from the available record, Edward had been expressing the specific hatred of the person who is required to be the thing he is required to be, and who has identified the requirement as the thing he most resents. His formation had not prepared him for the requirement. He had been the Prince of Wales since 16. The preparation for the prince had been the preparation of the person whom the preparation is organized around the function, rather than the person, the formation of the heir, that produces the heir, at the expense of the person the heir might otherwise have been. The person he might otherwise have been was not available. The heir was what was available. He needed someone to tell him he was not the heir, that what he felt was real, that the resentment was legitimate, that the requirement was the requirement of the institution rather than the requirement of his own authentic selfhood, and that his authentic selfhood was something the institution had been suppressing, and that the suppression was the injustice. Wallis told him all of this. She was the first person who had ever spoken to him as if he were a person rather than a prince. This is the specific biographical fact about the Wallis-Edward relationship that the people who were inside their social world have consistently identified as the fact that explains the attraction, not the beauty, not the sex, not the technique. The fact that she spoke to him plainly, directly, without the specific adjustment that proximity to royalty always produces in the people who are proximate to it. She told him when his tie was wrong. She told him when his posture was bad. She told him when the speech he had given was insufficient. She told him the things that the people around him had been declining to tell him across 22 years of the heir's formation. Edward had told his mistress, Frida Dudley Ward, in 1920, 11 years before he met Wallis, that he thought he was the kind of man who needs a certain amount of cruelty. The cruelty he was describing was not the cruelty of the abuse, it was the cruelty of the honest assessment, the cruelty of the person who will tell you what the other people have been declining to tell you, the cruelty of the direct. Wallis was direct. The directness was the formation's product, the specific quality of the person whose active management of the available world had produced the directness as the most efficient available management tool. You cannot manage what you will not assess directly. The assessment of Edward was the direct assessment. The direct assessment was what Edward required. He became obsessed with her. The obsession was the obsession of the person who has found, for the first time in the available experience, the person who will give him the thing he has been requiring that nobody else will give. The requirement was the direct assessment. The direct assessment was the cruelty he needed. Wallis provided the cruelty he needed. Their correspondence was the correspondence of the mother and the difficult child. Cecil Beaton, who photographed the Windsors extensively and who was a frequent guest at the various residences they occupied across the decades of the exile, observed the specific quality of the dynamic with the eye of the person who is in the room and who is recording what the room contains. He said, "She looks after him like a child and yet makes entertainment for him, as she did in the days when he was the prince coming to her home for relaxation at the end of a long day." The child, he called her Freddie Wadey. He wrote to her in the baby talk that the child produces for the primary attachment figure, the person whose specific role in the relationship is the role of the parent rather than the partner. Vui Angui. Your own little David is queeing so hard inside. The baby talk was not the affectionate nonsense of the couple's private language. It was the specific register of the person whose emotional age in the relationship was the emotional age of the child, whose primary attachment figure is the person managing the available world on the child's behalf. Wallis was managing the available world on his behalf. The managing was the thing she did. She had been managing the available world since the cheese-paring years. She was now managing the available world in the form of the heir to the British throne's available world, his schedule and his household and his staff and his correspondence, and the specific variety of the large-scale management that the management of the heir to the British throne's available world requires from the person managing it. Simultaneously, she was sleeping with the German ambassador. Joachim von Ribbentrop arrived in London as Germany's ambassador to the court of St. James in 1936. Before his ambassadorial appointment, he had been in London as a special envoy from Hitler, moving through the specific social world of the 1930s British upper class that had organized itself around the appeasement of the German political situation. He moved through the social world that Wallis moved through. The social world produced the encounter. The encounter produced 17 carnations, every day, sent to Wallis's address. The 17 was the accounting of the specific number of times they had slept together. Each carnation was the specific record of one occasion. 17 occasions. 17 carnations a day, arriving daily at the address of the woman who was simultaneously managing the Prince of Wales in the baby talk register of the primary attachment figure. The Ribbentrop affair is the affair that the romanticized account of the Wallis-Edward relationship has consistently managed in the direction of the historical footnote, the entertaining detail of the German ambassador's romantic scorecard, delivered in floral form. The management of it as the historical footnote is the management that obscures the specific dimension of the affair that the footnote treatment prevents from being examined. The specific dimension is this. In 1936, the year of the abdication, Wallis Simpson was simultaneously the primary attachment figure for the heir to, and then King of Great Britain, and conducting an affair with the representative of Adolf Hitler's government in London. The Ribbentrop who was sending the 17 carnations was the Ribbentrop who would later become the architect of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, the foreign minister of Nazi Germany, the man who helped organize the Holocaust's diplomatic dimension. He was hanged at Nuremberg in October 1946 for crimes against humanity. In 1936, Wallis was sleeping with him. She was also, simultaneously with the Edward management and the Ribbentrop affair, managing Ernest Simpson. Ernest was still her husband. Ernest was also, by the accounts of the period, conducting his own relationship with a woman named Mary Raffray, who was, with a specificity that the available account has preserved as the specific detail, one of Wallis's oldest friends. The Mary Raffray affair was not Ernest's spontaneous decision. It was the arrangement that the divorce required. The Church of England in 1936 accepted adultery as the grounds for divorce. Ernest was required to provide the grounds. The grounds required the evidence of the adultery. The adultery required the hotel room. The hotel room required the person. The person was Mary Raffray. Ernest and Mary Raffray were conveniently caught together in a hotel. This provided Wallis with the grounds for the divorce that she needed, in the specific form that the available legal framework required the grounds to be provided. The grounds were produced by the arrangement. The arrangement was Wallis's arrangement. Ernest, who by all accounts loved Wallis and who had been the steady provision that the sadistic alcoholic had been unable to be, accommodated the arrangement in the specific form of the person who goes to the hotel with his wife's oldest friend to provide the divorce grounds that his wife requires. He went to the hotel. He was caught. The divorce was granted. On the Nalin cruise in August 1936, the specific quality of the Wallis-Edward relationship was observed by Lady Diana Cooper, who was among the guests. Lady Cooper's diaries have been among the most valuable available records of the period, because they were the records of the observant person who was in the room and who was recording what the room contained, without the specific agenda of the palace, or the sympathizers, or the biographers. She wrote, "The truth is, she's bored stiff with him, and her picking on him and her coldness towards him, far from policy, are irritation and boredom. Bored stiff with him, not strategically cold, not calculated, bored." The irritation and the boredom of the person who is managing the difficult child and who has found, in the specific daily reality of the management, that the difficult child is the difficult child in the daily reality as well as in the registration of the requirement. She was managing him. The managing was the thing. The managing of Edward was the largest available management project. The largest available management project was the interest. When the interest is the management project and the management project is managed, the managed management project produces the boredom of the completed task. She had completed the task. He was managed. The boredom arrived. What she had not anticipated was the specific form that the managed task's completion would take. The managed task was supposed to take the form of the continuing arrangement, the managed prince, who would remain the managed prince, while she remained the manager. The managed prince was not supposed to become the managed king who was going to abdicate for her. She had not wanted the abdication. This is the biographical fact that the account of the Wallis-Edward relationship has been debating for 80 years, and that the available evidence supports in the specific form of the letters and the private communications of the abdication period. She had written to Edward, "You and I would only create disaster together." She had begged him not to abdicate. She had asked to be set free. The Anna Pasternak biography quotes her writing to Edward during the crisis. "It is the politicians whose game it is to have you forgotten and to build up the puppet they have placed on the throne. I was the convenient tool in their hands to use to get rid of you, the convenient tool." Whether the self-description of the convenient tool is the accurate description of her role, or the self-serving description of the person who had managed a king into abdicating, and who now needed the account of the managing to be the account of the managed, is the question that the available evidence does not resolve with the precision that the resolution would require. What is clear is that she was at the window of Buckingham Palace during the accession proclamation, grinning like a good-time girl with a new diamond, and that she was also writing to Edward that they would only create disaster together. Both things were true simultaneously. The grinning and the disaster letter. The desire for the crown and the knowledge that the crown would not be available to her in the form she wanted. The management of the king and the boredom with the king. The Ribbentrop carnations and the baby talk correspondence. All of them were true simultaneously. They were the truth of the person who had been managing the available world since the cheese-paring years, managing it in multiple directions simultaneously, producing in each direction the account that the direction required. maintaining the management across the contradiction of the multiple simultaneous directions. She had first words of me. She had managed 3 husbands, a German ambassador, and a king. She had done it simultaneously, in the specific form of the person whose formation in the cheese-paring years had produced the management as the organizing principle of the available world. The management had produced the abdication had produced the exile. The exile was where the management was going to spend the next 35 years. The exile was not what she had managed toward. On the 11th of December 1936, Edward VIII broadcast to the nation. He spoke from Windsor Castle. His brother, the Duke of York, who had been informed of the abdication the previous day, and who had wept, by accounts of the period, for an hour, was now King George VI. Edward was now nothing. Or rather, he was the Duke of Windsor, which was the title that the institution produced for the person who had been the king, and who was now the person the institution had converted from the king into the Duke of Windsor, in the specific form that the institution converts the former king into the Duke. He had given up the following: the most powerful throne in the world, an empire spanning a quarter of the globe, the constitutional monarchy of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions, the income of the sovereign, approximately £1.8 million per year in contemporary terms, Balmoral Castle, which he owned personally, Sandringham House, which he owned personally, the specific accumulated properties of the sovereign's personal estate. He also kept the following: a large amount of money in accounts that the subsequent investigation by his own brother's household would reveal he had been concealing. George VI had to borrow money from his own private resources to purchase Balmoral and Sandringham from his brother, properties that Edward had inherited and that the new king was now required to buy from the former king who had abdicated. The former king who had abdicated and who was living in French exile had not mentioned to his brother, in the discussions about the financial terms of the abdication, that he had considerably more money than he had disclosed. He lied to his brother about how much money he had. This is the biographical fact about the abdication's financial dimension, that the romantic version of the story, the king who gave up everything for love, has consistently managed in the direction of the not examined. The not examined financial dimension is the dimension of the person who gave up the throne, but who retained the concealed accounts, and who was simultaneously negotiating a financial allowance from his brother's new government on the basis of the disclosure that had omitted the concealed accounts. The romance required the sacrifice. The sacrifice required the giving up of everything. The financial reality was the giving up of everything except the money that had not been disclosed. The not disclosed money was the money that the romance did not require to be disclosed in the form that the financial reality required it to be disclosed. Wallis received the following from the abdication: a husband who had been a king, the title Duchess of Windsor, the denial of the HRH. That last item requires the specific examination because the denial of the HRH was not the bureaucratic decision of the institution's administration. It was the specific, deliberate decision of George VI, made on the advice of the palace's legal counsel, to deny the Her Royal Highness designation to the woman his brother had married. The denial was the institution's formal statement about Wallis Simpson, expressed in the specific institutional language of the title designation. It said, "She is not one of us. She will never be one of us. The marriage to the former king does not make her one of us. She is the Duchess of Windsor. She is not Her Royal Highness. She is not royal." The Queen Mother, who was Queen Elizabeth at the time, the wife of the new King George VI, called her that woman. Not Mrs. Simpson, not the Duchess, not Wallis, that woman. The two words that the Queen Mother deployed as the designation for Wallis Simpson are the two words that established the specific quality of the senior royal family's assessment of the marriage and the person the marriage had produced as the wife of the former king. The Queen Mother also, by the available accounts, bore a specific and sustained personal animosity toward Wallis that went beyond the institutional assessment of the inappropriate marriage. The animosity was the animosity of the person who had watched the abdication crisis produce the circumstance in which her husband, a man with a significant stutter who had not been prepared to be king and who had not wanted to be king, had been required by the abdication of the brother to become the king. George VI's reign had been produced by the abdication. The abdication had been produced by Wallis. The Queen Mother had lived through her husband's reign, knowing that the reign had been produced by the abdication that had been produced by Wallis. The knowledge organized the animosity. She maintained the animosity until her own death in 2002. 66 years of that woman. The same phrase would later be applied to Camilla Parker Bowles, in different circumstances, by different members of the same family, which is the specific institutional vocabulary of the senior royal woman's assessment of the inappropriate woman in the formal register of the two-word designation. The wedding was on the 3rd of June 1937 at the Château de Condé in France. No member of the royal family attended. This is not the statement of the occasional absence of the family member whose schedule had produced the inability to attend. It is the statement of the institution's deliberate collective non-attendance at the ceremony that the institution had decided required the collective non-attendance as the institutional statement of the assessment of the ceremony and of the woman the ceremony was producing as the wife of the former king. No royals attended. The guests were the Windsor's personal circle, the American friends, and the cosmopolitan social world that they had been cultivating in the south of France during the months between the abdication in December 1936 and the wedding in June 1937. It was not the wedding of the person who had expected it to be. It was the wedding in exile, without the institution, without the family, without the HRH, without the country that the former king had been the king of. What happened in the months between the abdication and the wedding established the specific character of the Wallis-Edward dynamic in the exile years. From the moment the abdication was announced, Wallis was in France. Edward was in Austria. They were separated by geography and by the specific management of the post-abdication period that the palace and the government were conducting in the direction of the managed separation of the former king from the woman whose presence in his proximity was the presence whose proximity had produced the crisis. The phone calls were constant. Long, demanding, exhausting phone calls in which the specific dynamic of the marriage's interior was visible in the earliest available form. The long telephone calls from Austria about finances and status, Wallis called them. The finances were the allowance from the new government. The status was the HRH question. The status was the question that she was going to pursue for 35 years. Kenneth de Courcy, who moved in the Windsor's social world across the exile years, and who produced one of the most direct available accounts of the dynamic from the inside of the world that the dynamic was being conducted in, described the specific character of her behavior toward Edward in the private domestic space of the marriage. She went at him morning, noon and night, right up to 1 o'clock in the morning, 2 o'clock in the morning, steaming up against his family. She went on and on and on and on. The steaming against his family, the on and on and on and on. De Courcy's account is the account of the observer who was present in the social world and who was describing the specific quality of the daily domestic reality of the Windsor's marriage from the position of the person who was close enough to the reality to observe it. The steaming against his family was the specific activity that the exile had organized Wallis around as the available organizing activity when the available organizing activities had been reduced to the exile's available activities, which were the social engagements of the international wealthy classes circuit of houses and parties and dinners, and the specific complaint against the family that had produced the exile by not attending the wedding and denying the HRH and calling her that woman. The complaint was real. The complaint had genuine material in the grievance of the person who had been denied the HRH and who had been called that woman, and who had not had a single member of the royal family at the wedding, and who was now living in France because the country that her husband had been the king of was not available to them in the form of the available residence. The grievances were real. The on and on and on was what the real grievances produced in the person who had organized her life around the active management of the available world, and who had found in the exile that the available management's most available target was the family that had denied the HRH and attended the non-wedding and called her that woman. Edward absorbed it. He had asked for the cruelty in 1920. He was receiving it in the form of the on and on and on against his family at 1 o'clock and 2 o'clock in the morning in the various residences of the exile. The absorption was the absorption of the person who had told Frieda Dudley Ward that he needed the cruelty, and who was now receiving the cruelty in the domestic form that the exile had made available as the cruelty. Diana Cooper had observed the boredom on the Nalin in August 1936, 4 months before the abdication. The boredom was already present in the relationship before the abdication had converted the relationship from the relationship of the married woman managing the king into the relationship of the exiled duchess managing the former king, with no throne and no institutional function and no country and nowhere to go except the circuit of houses and parties and dinners of the international wealthy class. The circuit of houses and parties and dinners was not the thing. It was the thing that was available. The thing that would have been the thing was the crown. The crown was the thing that the grinning at the window of Buckingham Palace had been grinning at. The crown was not available. It had never been available. The Church of England did not permit the king to marry a twice-divorced woman. The Church of England's position was the position that had been clear throughout the crisis. The crown was not available. She had the duchy. She had the on and on and on at 2 o'clock in the morning. She had the circuit of houses and parties. She had the denied HRH. She had the that woman. She had the non-attended wedding. She had the exile. Me had produced the exile. The exile was going to last 35 years. The exile was going to produce the Bahamas governorship and the Nazi Germany tour and the Hitler tea and the drinking vodka from silver tankards and the anorexia and the Jimmy Donahue affair and the attempted seduction of Herman Rogers and the demented jealousy over Lucy Wan and the final decline and the dementia and the imprisonment in the Paris villa. The exile was the cost of the abdication. The abdication had been the largest available thing. The largest available thing had produced the exile. That was the accounting. 4 months after the wedding at the Château de Candé, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor toured Nazi Germany. The tour was in October 1937. They had married in June. They were 4 months into the exile, 4 months of the circuit of houses and parties, and the on and on and on against the family, at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the denied HRH, and the that woman. 4 months. And then they went to Germany. The tour was organized with the specific assistance of the Nazi government. Robert Ley, the head of the German Labour Front, and a committed Nazi ideologue, who would later be indicted at Nuremberg, and who would hang himself in his cell before the sentence could be carried out, extended the invitation. The invitation was accepted. The Windsors arrived in Germany in October 1937 and spent 2 weeks being shown what the Nazi government wanted them to see. They visited factories. They visited housing projects. They inspected what the Nazi government presented as the achievements of the German Labour Front's management of the German workers' life under National Socialism. They gave the Nazi salute. Photographs of Edward giving the Nazi salute in Germany in October 1937 exist in the photographic record of the tour. The former King of Great Britain giving the Nazi salute in Germany in October 1937, 4 months after abdicating the throne of the country that would be at war with the country whose salute he was giving within 2 years. The photographs exist. They were taken. The salutes were given. They met Hitler. On the 22nd of October 1937, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor were received by Adolf Hitler at his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. The meeting was documented. The accounts of the meeting have been preserved in the various sources that the meeting's documentation has produced. The records of the participants, the diplomatic communications, the accounts of the people in Hitler's circle who were present. Hitler was apparently charmed by Edward. Hitler said, in the accounts of the meeting that his circle produced, that Edward would have made a good king if he had stayed. He thought, in the Nazi imagination of the British constitutional situation, that Edward could have been a useful instrument for the German policy toward Britain, the specific policy of the German government that was oriented around the possibility of the British accommodation with German expansionism rather than the British resistance to it. Wallis tried to flirt with Hitler. She had been told that Hitler's eyes were magnetic, burning with a particular fire. She had formed this assessment from the accounts she had received of the specific quality of Hitler's personal presence. the charisma that the accounts of the people who met him in the 1930s consistently describe as the disturbing combination of the intense personal attention and the ideological certainty. She arrived at Berchtesgaden in the expectation of the magnetic eyes and the particular fire. She deployed the available management tools in the direction of the magnetic eyes and the particular fire. The available management tools were the tools that the China years and the Win Spencer years and the Ernest Simpson years and the Prince of Wales years had developed in the specific form of the active management of the available world's most significant available resource, which was the attention of the powerful man. She deployed them at Hitler. Hitler did not respond. She concluded, in the account that Andrew Morton's biography Wallace in Love has preserved from the available sources, that the failure of the deployment was the failure that the specific character of the target's preference produced. "I decided he did not care for women," she said. "I decided he did not care for women." The conclusion of the person whose management tools were the management tools of the attractive woman in the presence of the powerful man, and who had encountered, in the powerful man at Berchtesgaden, the powerful man whose preferences were not organized around the attraction of the attractive woman. The failure of the tool was attributed to the preference of the target rather than to the specific character of the target and the specific character of the situation that the target and the situation together produced. The dinner party comments were the comments that the available sources have preserved as the comments that established the specific character of the Windsor's anti-Semitic views in the domestic rather than the diplomatic register. One source who reported to Andrew Morton described the experience of having dinner with the Windsors in the period following the German tour. The source's parents had been at the dinner. They were horrified by the dinner table talk, the source told Morton, where they made it perfectly clear that the world would have been a better place if Jews were exterminated. The world would have been a better place if Jews were exterminated, at the dinner table, to the guests. By the former King of Great Britain and his wife, 4 months after their wedding, in the specific register of the private social occasions conversation about the preferred outcomes of the political situation. This is not the diplomatic flirtation with Germany that the appeasement era produced in a significant portion of the British upper class. This is the specific statement of the genocidal preference expressed at the dinner table that the guests whose horror at the statement Morton's source preserved in the account that the account has transmitted to the available record. What the British government knew about the Windsors' relationship with Nazi Germany was the question that the declassified documents and the subsequent historical research have been addressing across the decades since the war. The research has produced the picture of the British government's specific concern, not about the dinner table conversations, which the government was not in the position of the dinner guest, and which the government did not have the dinner table conversations' specific content available to it, in the form that the content requires to be available, but about the strategic dimension. The strategic dimension was the dimension that the Operation Willy episode made most precisely visible. Operation Willy was the German intelligence operation of the summer of 1940, after France had fallen, and the Windsors were in Lisbon, awaiting the posting to the Bahamas that Winston Churchill had arranged to get them out of Europe. The German operation was organized around the possibility of detaining or luring the Duke back to Spain, and from there, keeping him available as the potential puppet king of a defeated Britain that had reached the accommodation with Germany rather than the resistance. Philip Ziegler, whose authorized biography assessed the evidence with the specific care of the authorized biographer who has access to the restricted archive, concluded, "There seems little doubt that Edward did think Britain was likely to lose the war, and that, in such a case, he believed he might have a role to play. As the puppet king of a defeated Britain, as the instrument of the German policy toward the British accommodation, as the former king who would be reinstated on the throne by the German victory in the country that he had abdicated from in December 1936. Andrew Lowney, in his Traitor King, went further than Ziegler in the specific assessment of the available evidence. His book drew on German government documents found by the American military just before the end of the war, on FBI documents, on State Department documents, on the various intelligence archives that the subsequent decades of the declassification process had made available. The picture that the documents produced was the picture of the Windsors, whose relationship to the German intelligence operation was the relationship of the people who were, at minimum, not resisting the operation, and who may have been, at the maximum of the available evidence's interpretation, actively involved in it. The Windsors were also, during the period of the retreat from France in May 1940, concerned about their linens. The German invasion of France had begun. The British military was in full retreat. The world was at the hinge point of its most significant crisis. The Windsors sent a servant to retrieve their linens from their Paris residence. The servant was assisted by Edward's Nazi contacts. While Paris was falling, the Windsors were recovering their table linens with the assistance of Nazi contacts. Winston Churchill was required to communicate directly with Edward on multiple occasions during the summer of 1940 to compel the former king to comply with the government's requirements about his movements and his behavior. The compelling was the compelling of the head of the wartime government communicating with the former king in the specific form of the governmental requirement that the former king comply with, rather than the form of the suggestion. Edward required the compelling. The compelling required Churchill's direct attention in the summer of 1940, when Churchill's direct attention had rather more significant available demands on it. The Bahamas posting was the management. Churchill arranged the Bahamas because the Bahamas was the place that was far enough from Europe and from the German operation and from the possibility of the puppet king scenario to make the Duke's presence in the Bahamas the available management of the Duke's presence in the situation. The Bahamas was a way to get him out of the way. The Duchess hated the Bahamas. Philip Ziegler noted that she made no secret of her views to those close to her. The views were the views of the person who had managed the available world in the direction of the most significant available things, and who had been produced by the management into the Bahamas rather than into the Crown. The Bahamas was the specific form of the management's failure, not the personal failure, the failure of the available world to respond to the management in the direction that the management had been organizing the available world toward. The available world had been organized toward the Crown. The Crown had produced the exile. The exile had produced the German tour. The German tour had produced the Operation Willy possibility. The Operation Willy possibility had produced the Bahamas. The Bahamas was where the management ended up. She hated it. She said so. She was nearly driven mad by the boredom of Nassau and the limited society and the heat and the specific quality of the colony's available world that was not the available world of the circuit of houses and parties and dinners of the international wealthy class. It was Nassau. It was the Bahamas. It was the management's destination. She ran the household. She ran it with the same specificity and the same precision that she had run every available household. The meticulous management of the domestic space and the social occasion and the specific variety of the active management that the formation had produced as the organizing principle. She organized the charities. She organized the hospital. Ziegler gave her credit for it. She performed the duties of governor's lady conscientiously and well. She entertained stylishly and went through the rituals of opening bazaars and inspecting hospitals with unexpected grace. The unexpected grace was the grace of the person who manages the available space with the available management tools, regardless of whether the available space is the international wealthy classes circuit or the Bahamas governorship circuit. The available management tools were deployed in the available space. The available space was Nassau. The unexpected grace was the deployment. She was not in London. She was not Queen. The Crown was not available. She was in Nassau, hating Nassau, managing Nassau with unexpected grace, steaming against the family at 2 o'clock in the morning, with 17 carnations in her recent past, and the Hitler tea, and the world would have been a better place, and the table linens recovered with Nazi contacts while Paris fell. This was what the me had produced. After the Bahamas, there was the circuit. The circuit was the life that the exile had produced as the available life, when the available life was the life of the international wealthy classes circuit of houses and parties and dinners, and the specific social occasions that the international wealthy classes circuit produces for the people who are inside it. The Windsors were inside it. They were inside it for 30 years, from 1945, when the Bahamas posting ended, to 1972, when Edward died. 30 years of the circuit. Cecil Beaton documented the circuit. He was the specific person whose position in the circuit, the photographer and the designer and the social observer whose presence at the occasions of the international wealthy class was the presence of the person who was producing the documentation of the occasions while simultaneously being inside them, had placed him in the precise position of the person who could see the circuit from the inside and produce the account of it. He produced the account. The account was the account of the elegance. The elegance was real. The Windsors were the most photographed, most documented, most precisely recorded elegant couple of the mid-20th century. The houses they lived in were decorated with the specific care of the people who understood that the decoration was the available activity when the available activities had been reduced to the decoration and the circuit. The table settings at the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne were the table settings of the person who had spent 30 years managing the available domestic space with the available management tools in the form of the most precise domestic management that the available management could produce. The food was extraordinary. The management was extraordinary. The specific quality of the domestic excellence that Wallis produced in the available domestic spaces of the exile was the quality of the person who had nothing else to manage and who managed the available nothing else with everything. She also, gradually and then thoroughly, stopped eating it. Wallis Simpson had maintained for most of her adult life the specific proposition that you could never be too rich or too thin. The proposition was not the casual observation of the person making a joke about the social standards of the wealthy. It was the organizing principle of her relationship to her own body, the specific management of the available physical self in the direction of the maximum available thinness as the available expression of the maximum available control. The thinness became the anorexia. In the exile years, after the Bahamas, and after the beginning of the circuit, and after the management of the available domestic space had produced the extraordinary food that she did not eat, she became anorexic. The vodka from the silver tankards replaced the food that the extraordinary food that she had managed into existence did not replace. When she drank, Edward drank. The circuit was the circuit of the two people who were drinking from silver tankards and going to parties and being photographed in the specific elegance that the photographs of the period have preserved. One account of the period described the specific quality of what Beaton's lens was capturing, immortalized by the photographer's flashes, their elegance grotesque in their drunkenness. They held on tight to each other, the elegance grotesque in their drunkenness. The image of the two people who had produced the most significant crisis in the constitutional history of the British monarchy in the 20th century, holding on tight to each other in the photographer's flash, in the specific elegance of the late-night departure from the party. The circuit was the party. The party was the circuit. The circuit was the life. Cecil Beaton observed the specific quality of the life from the inside of the circuit. He saw both things simultaneously, the elegance and what the elegance was covering. He wrote, "She now gives him the antidote to hard work, but he has none of the hard work. He has nothing to do. She is nearly driven mad trying to find ways of amusing him. He has no interests. He thought he was bored at being royalty, and he has no reason since to consider he has stopped being bored. He has no interests. He thought he was bored at being royalty, and he has no reason since to consider he has stopped being bored." This is the account of the marriage's interior that the circuit was organized around covering. The man who had given up the empire to be with the woman he loved had not, in the giving up, resolved the specific boredom that had organized his relationship to the empire he was giving up. He had been bored by the requirement of the prince. He was still bored. He was now bored in a different set of rooms, with the same woman he had been bored with since the Nahlin cruise in August 1936. Wallis was nearly driven mad. Beaton saw it. She was managing the boredom of the man who had nothing to do and no interests and who had not stopped being bored, and she was simultaneously managing the circuit and the houses and the decoration and the food she did not eat and the vodka from the silver tankards. The boredom and the management produced the Jimmy Donahue affair. James Paul Donahue Jr. was the heir to the Woolworth fortune. He was American, fabulously wealthy, and gay. He was also, by the accounts of the people who knew him in the period of his involvement with the Windsors in the late 1940s and early 1950s, spectacularly entertaining in the specific form that the fabulously wealthy gay man of mid-20th century American society can be spectacularly entertaining. The wit and the irreverence and the specific talent for the social occasion that his formation and his money and his freedom from the conventional requirements had produced. He entered the Windsors' social world in the late 1940s. He became, in the early 1950s, Wallis's companion in a form that produced the specific biographical controversy about the Donahue affair that the available accounts of the affair have been unable to fully resolve. The controversy is the controversy of the specific character of the relationship. Was it a full affair? Was it an intimate friendship of the kind that can develop between a bored woman and an entertaining gay man who offers her the specific attention that the bored husband has stopped providing? Was it something else, something that involved Edward in the specific form that the most disturbing of the available accounts has suggested? The most disturbing of the available accounts has suggested that Edward not only knew about the intimacy between Wallis and Donahue, but was present for it. That the arrangement had a specific character that placed Edward in the role of the witness to the intimacy between his wife and the Woolworth heir. That the relationship between Wallis and Donahue was the relationship that the marriage's specific dynamic produced as the available management of the marriage's specific interior, when the marriage's specific interior was the interior of the man who had told Freda Dudley Ward in 1920 that he needed a certain amount of cruelty. Whether this specific dimension of the Donahue affair is accurate is the question that the available sources have not resolved with the certainty that the certainty would require. What is established is that Donahue was in Wallis's life in a form that went beyond the social acquaintance. What is established is that Edward tolerated the arrangement in a form that produced specific comment from the people who observed the three of them together. What is established is that the arrangement ended badly. Donahue said afterward, in the account that has been preserved from the period of the affair's ending, that Wallis wanted to leave Edward for him, that she would have left Edward for him, that the man she wanted was not the former king who was bored and had no interests, and required the endless management, but the fabulously wealthy, entertaining gay man who made her laugh and who paid her the attention that the bored man who was nearly driving her mad had stopped paying. The ending of the Donahue affair was the ending that produced the specific account of the affair's character in the form of the ended affair's account, which is the account that the party who felt wronged by the ending produces in the form most available to them. Donahue produced his account. The account was the account of the woman who had wanted to leave the Duke for him and who had ultimately not left. She did not leave, she stayed with Edward. The staying was the staying of the person who had calculated the available options and had concluded that the former king, however bored, and however uninteresting, and however requiring of the endless management, was the available option that the available options required in the form of the staying. The Woolworth heir was not the available option that the staying required. He was the available entertainment. The entertainment ended, she stayed. The circuit continued. The parties continued. The vodka from the silver tankards continued. The elegance grotesque in the drunkenness continued. The attempts to amuse the man who had nothing to do continued. The on and on and on against the family continued. What also continued, throughout the exile years, was the status question. The HRH denial had been the denial of the institution that had organized itself around the denial from the moment of the abdication. Wallis had pursued the HRH across the 35 years of the exile, with the same specific persistence that the active management of the available world produces. When the available world has declined to provide the most significant available thing, she never received it. The institution declined to provide it across the full 35 years of the exile. George VI declined to provide it. Elizabeth II declined to provide it. The Queen Mother, still that woman, still the person whose specific animosity toward Wallis had organized itself around the that woman designation from the moment of the abdication, maintained the position. The Queen Mother outlived the Duke. Edward died on the 28th of May 1972 in the Paris villa. He was 77 years old. Wallis was by his side. The marriage had lasted 35 years. 35 years of the circuit, and the vodka from the silver tankards, and the boredom, and the management, and the anorexia, and the Donahue affair, and the on and on and on, against the family, and the denied HRH. Wallis said, in the account that has survived the period of Edward's final illness, "You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance. You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance." The great romance was the abdication. The abdication was the largest available thing. The largest available thing had produced the circuit, and the vodka, and the boredom, and the management. The management of the boredom, and the circuit, and the vodka had been the great romance's daily reality. It had been very hard. She had said so. She was right. Herman Rogers died of throat cancer in May 1949. She had been Wallis Simpson's closest friend for decades. She and her husband Herman Rogers had sheltered Wallis in their villa in Cannes during the abdication crisis. The months between December 1936 and June 1937, when Wallis was in France and Edward was in Austria, and the world was producing its specific opinion of the person who had caused a king to abandon his throne. The Rogers had sheltered her. Herman had helped organize the wedding at the Château de Condé. Herman had been the constant, the friend and the advisor, and the specific steady presence in Wallis's life through all of it. Catherine had also been there through all of it. Catherine died in May 1949. Before the poor woman had been buried, Wallis had begun her pursuit of Herman. The pursuit is documented in Andrew Morton's Wallis in Love, which drew on the account of Lucy Wan's daughter-in-law Kitty Blair, a woman who spent many hours with Lucy discussing Herman and Wallis, and who produced the account from the inside of the social world that the pursuit was conducted in. "There is no question that these women were rivals in love," Kitty Blair said. "Both wanted Herman. Wallis would have grabbed him and told the Duke to go. Lucy knew that. Wallis would have grabbed Herman and told the Duke to go." The Duke was the former King of Great Britain, Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas. The man she would have told to go was the man for whom the most significant constitutional crisis of the 20th century had been produced. The man she would have grabbed instead was Herman Rogers, Brown University educated, athletic, devoted, steady, the man who had sheltered her during the abdication and organized the wedding and remained the most constant of friends across the decades of the exile. This is the biographical fact that reorganizes the Wallis Simpson story when it is examined with the attention it deserves. The great romance, the king who gave up his empire for love, had, at its center, a woman who would have told the king to go if the man she actually wanted had become available. Herman had been available for years in the form of the married man. The married man is the specific available form of the person you actually want when the person you actually want is married to someone else. Wallis had been managing the available world in the direction of the Herman attachment for years before Catherine's death. The friendship that the friendship's sustained intimacy had produced as the specific variety of the attachment that sustains itself across the decades in the specific form of the not yet available. Catherine's death made him available. Wallis had one clear rival for the available Herman. Lucy Wan was a socially ambitious widow who had befriended both the Duke and Duchess. She understood immediately that Wallis was the competition. She moved quickly. Within months of Catherine's death, Lucy was putting pressure on Herman to marry her. She had one significant advantage over Wallis. She was not married to the former King of England. Wallis was demented with jealousy. This is Andrew Morton's characterization of her emotional state in the period of the competition with Lucy Wan for Herman Rogers. The demented jealousy of the person whose actual emotional attachment has produced the demented quality of the jealousy that the unavailability of the actual emotional attachment generates. She tried to sabotage it. The sabotage was the sabotage of the active manager managing the available obstacle in the direction of the obstacle's removal. She deployed the available management tools. She worked on Herman. She worked on the social world around Herman. She communicated the specific message to the specific people whose proximity to Herman made them the relevant people to communicate the message to. Lucy outmaneuvered her. Herman married Lucy in 1950, 1 year after Catherine's death. Wallis was demented with jealousy and the jealousy had not prevented the marriage. The marriage produced the specific form of the defeat that the jealousy had been organized around preventing. Herman died in 1954. Lucy outlived him. Wallis attended the funeral. The attending of the funeral of the man she had been demented with jealousy about was the attending of the person who had maintained the friendship in the specific form that the maintained friendship takes when the maintained friendship is the friendship of the person whose actual attachment is the attachment that the friendship is covering. Now examine what the Herman Rogers story tells. It tells that the woman for whom a king abdicated was not primarily in love with the king. She was managing him. She was good at managing him. She found him interesting in the specific way that the most significant available management project is interesting. She needed him in the specific way that the person who has been managing the available world since the cheese-pairing years needs the largest available management project. But she was not in love with him in the specific sense of the attachment that the demented jealousy had produced in the direction of Herman Rogers. The king had abdicated for love. The love had been real. Edward's love for Wallis had been real, in the specific form of the obsessive attachment of the person whose need for the cruelty and the management had produced the obsessive attachment to the person who provided them. It was real. But it had not been reciprocal in the specific sense that the abdication narrative required it to be reciprocal in order for the abdication narrative to be the abdication narrative. She had been bored stiff with him on the Nachlin in 1936, 4 months before the abdication. Diana Cooper had written it in her diary. She had been willing to grab Herman and tell the Duke to go in 1949, 13 years after the abdication. These are the two data points that the Herman Rogers story and the Nallen observation together produce when assembled into the honest account of the emotional reality that the abdication narrative had been organized around covering. The abdication narrative required the love to be the love of the great romance. The great romance required the mutual obsession. The mutual obsession required both parties to the obsession to be equally obsessed. Edward was equally obsessed. Wallis was managing. She said it herself. You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance. The hard was the hard of the managing rather than the hard of the loving. The managing is hard. The loving is the emotion. The managing of the great romance across 35 years of the circuit, and the vodka from the silver tankards, and the boredom, and the attempts to find ways to amuse the man who had nothing to do, and no interests, was the managing of the hard. What the Herman Rogers story also tells is the story of the thing that the something of Wallis Simpson was always actually organized around. Not the crown. She had not wanted the crown. The letters and the accounts of the abdication crisis establish that she had not wanted the abdication and had told Edward they would create disaster together. Not the king. She would have told the king to go. The thing the something was organized around was the thing that the cheese-pairing years and the Uncle Sol and the $60 a month and the Win Spencer and the China years had produced as the organizing principle of the available life, which was the secure attachment of the person who stays. Herman stayed. He stayed across the decades. He sheltered her during the abdication. He organized the wedding. He helped her through the abdication's aftermath. He stayed. When Catherine was alive, he stayed as the friend. When Catherine died, he was briefly available in the form of the available attachment. Lucy Wan took him. He died in 1954. The secure attachment was what the formation had always been pursuing. The cheese-pairing poverty had been the absence of the secure provision. Uncle Sol had been the capricious provision. Win Spencer had been the sadistic provision. Ernest Simpson had been the closest available form of the secure provision, and she had managed him out of the marriage in order to manage the king into it. The king had not been the secure provision. He had been the largest available management project. Herman Rogers had been the closest thing to the actual secure attachment that the formation had been organized around, requiring since the Blue Ridge Summit Cottage in 1896, where nobody filed the birth certificate. She never got it. The secure attachment remained the thing that the active management had been managing toward, and that the active management had been consistently managing away from, in the specific form that the active management of the available world produces when the active management is the substitute for the thing the management is organized around obtaining. She managed everything. She never managed the thing she actually wanted. The thing she actually wanted was Herman Rogers, who married Lucy Wan. If you are enjoying this story so far, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel going, and I read every single comment. Drop one below, telling me where in the world you are watching from. The Duke died in 1972. She was 75 years old. She had managed him for 35 years. She had managed the circuit and the houses and the decoration and the extraordinary food she did not eat, and the vodka from the silver tankards, and the attempts to find ways to amuse the man who had nothing to do and no interests. And when he died, she did not manage well at all. Edward died on the 28th of May 1972. He had been ill for some time. The throat cancer diagnosis had come earlier that year, and the illness had produced the specific visible deterioration of the person whose illness is the illness of the long and difficult dying rather than the sudden. He died in the early morning at the Villa Windsor in the Bois de Boulogne, in the Paris house that had been the center of the circuit's available domestic management for the exile years. The Queen visited him before he died. This is the biographical detail of the final chapter of the Edward and Wallis story that the available account has preserved, as the detail that most precisely establishes the specific character of the institution's relationship to the man who had abdicated from it 35 years earlier. The Queen visited the Villa Windsor on the 18th of May 1972. She was in Paris for a state visit. She came to see her uncle. Edward was in his bedroom when she arrived. He was dying. He was a former king who was dying in the Paris villa that the exile had been conducted from. His niece, who was the queen of the country he had abdicated from, came to his bedside. Wallis received the Queen at the Villa Windsor. The meeting between the Queen of England and the woman that the institution had called that woman and denied the HRH and declined to attend the wedding of, was the meeting of the two women whose specific relationship to the same institution had been the relationship of the inside and the outside across the 35 years of the exile. The Queen came to the villa. Wallis received her. Edward was dying. 10 days later, Edward was dead. Wallis flew to England for the funeral. She was received at Buckingham Palace. The Queen Mother received her. The Queen Mother, who had called her that woman for 35 years, who had maintained the that woman designation across the abdication and the exile and the Nazi Germany tour and the denied HRH and the Jimmy Donahue affair and the circuit and the vodka from the silver tankards and the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers, received Wallis Simpson at Buckingham Palace for the first time since before the abdication. The reception was the reception of the institution that manages the available situation in the available form when the available situation is the funeral of the former king. The funeral was managed. The reception was managed. The Queen Mother managed the reception. Wallis was described by the people who observed her during the funeral proceedings as a woman who appeared already to be somewhere else. The somewhere else was the beginning of the decline, the specific rapid deterioration of the person whose organizing principle had been the management of the available world in the direction of the largest available management project, and whose largest available management project had just been removed by the death. She had managed Edward for 35 years. For 35 years, the management of Edward had been the available activity that the circuit and the houses and the food she did not eat, and the vodka from the silver tankards had been organized around. The management was the activity was the management. When the management's object was removed by the death, the activity had no object. The activity without the object produced the decline. Not immediately, the decline was the gradual production of the person who has lost the organizing principle and who is managing the available world in the direction of the not managing rather than the managing. The not managing was the decline. The decline produced the dementia. The dementia was the specific medical condition of the final years, the Alzheimer's disease that the available medical record has established as the condition that Wallis Simpson was managing in the last decade of her life, alongside the physical deterioration that the decades of the anorexia and the vodka from the silver tankards had been producing in the available body across the exile years. She became, in the final years, the prisoner of the Paris villa. Maître Suzanne Blum was Wallis's French lawyer. She had been Wallis's lawyer for years. The specific professional relationship of the prominent person and the lawyer whose role expands, in the available circumstances of the declining prominent person, from the legal advisory into the available management of the declining person's affairs, in the form that the available management of the declining person's affairs takes when the declining person's capacity for the management of the available affairs has been reduced by the decline, to the point at which the management requires the lawyer rather than the person. Blum expanded her management of Wallis's affairs in the direction of the total. The total management was the management of everything: the household, the staff, the visitors, the correspondence, the will. The will was the specific dimension of the management that produced the most specific available concern in the people who were observing the management from the outside. Wallis's will had been organized around the specific estate that the 35 years of the exile circuit had accumulated, the jewelry that was among the most significant available private collections of the 20th century, the contents of the Villa Windsor, the specific accumulation of the wealthy exile's decades of collecting the things that the circuit and the houses and the decoration had produced as the available things. It was a substantial estate. The will changed. The people who had been expecting to be in the will found themselves removed from it. The charitable bequests that the will had previously contained were reorganized. The Institut Pasteur in Paris, the specific medical research institution that Blum had connections to, became the primary beneficiary of the reorganized will. Friends who attempted to visit Wallis were turned away. Michael Bloch, whose access to the Windsor papers had produced the most detailed available account of the final years, described the specific character of the isolation that Blum had organized around Wallis. The friends who had been the friends of the circuit years, the people whose presence in the Windsor's social world had been the presence of the circuit's social world, were declined at the door. The door was maintained by the management. The management was Blum's. The servants were dismissed. The specific household that Wallis had managed with the extraordinary precision of the person who had been managing the available domestic space since the Bryanston Court years, was now managed by Blum's management rather than Wallis's management. The household Wallis had managed was replaced by the household Blum managed. The people who managed to see Wallis in the final years, who got through the management despite the management's prevention, described what they found. They described a woman who was unresponsive, who did not speak, who did not recognize them, who was maintained in the specific condition of the person who is maintained rather than cared for, in the sense of the person whose maintenance is the maintenance of the available body rather than the maintenance of the available person. There were suggestions that the maintenance included medication beyond what the medical condition required. The suggestions were the suggestions of the people who had seen Wallis and who had identified in the specific quality of the unresponsiveness something that went beyond the dementia's available unresponsiveness into the specific unresponsiveness of the person who is medicated in the direction of the more unresponsive. Whether this was true is the question that the available evidence has not resolved with the certainty that the certainty would require. What is established is the isolation. The isolation is documented. The friends turned away is documented. The changed will is documented. The dismissed servants are documented. The Institut Pasteur as beneficiary is documented. What the isolation produced, whether it produced the deterioration that the isolation compounds in the person who is already deteriorating from dementia, or whether it produced something more deliberate, is the question whose answer the isolation prevents from being the question whose answer the available evidence can produce. Maître Suzanne Blum was also managing, in the years of the management of Wallis's decline, the public image of Wallis Simpson in the available public record. She was not passive in the management of the public image. She was aggressive. She mounted legal challenges to publications that she regarded as defamatory to the Duchess. She pursued the protection of the Duchess's image in the available legal forms. She was the person managing the Duchess's image, while simultaneously managing the person whose image she was managing, in the specific form of the isolation and the changed will and the dismissed servants and the friends turned away. Wallis Simpson died on the 24th of April 1986. She was 89 years old. She had been born in the Blue Ridge Summit Cottage in June 1896, where no one had filed the birth certificate. She had managed 3 husbands and a German ambassador and a king. She had produced the abdication of Edward VIII and the constitutional crisis of 1936. She had lived through the exile and the Bahamas, and the circuit, and the vodka from the silver tankards, and the anorexia, and the Jimmy Donahue affair, and the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers, and the dementia, and the isolation of the final years. She was buried on the 29th of April 1986 at Frogmore, in the Royal Burial Ground at Windsor. She was buried beside Edward, the institution that had called her that woman and denied her the HRH and not attended her wedding, buried her in the Royal Burial Ground, beside the man who had abdicated to marry her. The Queen attended the funeral. The HRH was not given to her, not in life, not at the funeral, not in the death. The institution managed the burial. The HRH was not part of the management. The institution buried her in the Royal Burial Ground and denied her the HRH simultaneously. The burial was the management of the available situation. The HRH denial was the management of the available institution. Both managed simultaneously. She was at Frogmore. She had the Royal Burial Ground. She did not have the HRH. She had never had the HRH. The Oldfield School, where Uncle Sol had paid the fees, the most expensive girls' school in Maryland, had also buried her without the HRH. The cheese-paring years had been managed into the Royal Burial Ground at Windsor. The $60 a month from Uncle Sol's will had been managed into the most significant private jewelry collection of the 20th century. She had managed everything she managed into the available destination. The available destination was the Royal Burial Ground at Windsor and the denied HRH, and the management that the available management had produced across the 90 years of the management. Me. First words, Royal Burial Ground. No HRH. This was the accounting. The title of this account proposes that Wallis Simpson was grasping, ruthless, and never satisfied. 7 parts of evidence have now been assembled. The honest verdict requires the honest examination of all 3 propositions: the grasping, the ruthless, the never satisfied, in the specific form that the assembled evidence produces, rather than the form that the romanticized account or the condemnatory account has been producing. The biographers have disagreed violently. Anna Pasternak, whose 2019 biography The Real Wallis Simpson presented the most systematically sympathetic available account of Wallis in modern scholarship, argued that Wallis was the victim of the abdication rather than its architect, the woman who had been caught in Edward's obsessive neediness and who had genuinely not wanted the abdication and who had begged to be set free and who had been denied the understanding and the charity that the situation required from the institution and the press and the public. Pasternak's Wallis is warm, well-mannered, witty, diffident, charming, not in the least ambitious. She did not want to be queen, she wanted her life back. Andrew Lowney, whose traitor king drew on the declassified intelligence documents and the German military archives and the FBI files, and who produced the most damaging available documented account of the Windsor's relationship with Nazi Germany, presented the version in which the grasping and the ruthless and the never satisfied are not the tabloid exaggerations of the hostile press, but the documented characterizations of the available evidence. Both biographers are using the same person. The honest verdict requires the honest examination of both accounts against the evidence that the 7 parts have assembled. The examination produces the following. On the grasping. Philip Ziegler was precise about the origin. She spent her childhood in cheese-paring poverty, resentfully aware that her friends could afford nicer clothes and more lavish holidays. It seems reasonable to trace to this early deprivation the acquisitive streak which so strongly marked her character. The acquisitive streak was real. The jewelry collection that the exile accumulated was one of the most significant private collections of the 20th century. The pursuit of the HRH, across 35 years, was the pursuit of the institutional designation that the institution had denied and that the acquisitive streak had identified as the thing that required the pursuing in the form that the pursuing required. The $60 a month from Uncle Sol had produced in the person whose $60 a month it had been, the specific relationship to the available world's available things, in which the things required the active management toward possession. But the grasping requires the honest examination of the specific direction of the grasping. She grasped toward the jewelry and toward the HRH and toward the status. She did not grasp toward the crown. The letters of the abdication period establish, in the form that the letters establish when the letters are the letters, rather than the romantic account's version of the letters, that she had told Edward they would create disaster together, and had asked to be set free. The crown was the thing that the grasping did not reach for in the specific deliberate form of the reaching. The grasping is accurate as the characterization of the formation's organizing principle. The grasping is not accurate as the characterization of the abdication's cause in the specific form that the grasping caused the abdication. The abdication was caused by Edward's obsession in the specific form that the obsession of the person who had told Frida Dudley Ward in 1920 that he needed the cruelty causes the thing the obsession produces when the cruelty's provider is the person the obsession has identified as the available provider. On the ruthless. The ruthless is the accurate characterization of the specific quality of the active management of the available world that the formation had produced as the organizing principle. The management of Win Spencer's departure through the China strategy and the divorce residence in Virginia. The management of Ernest Simpson's departure through the arranged hotel adultery with her oldest friend Mary Raffray. The management of the abdication period through the simultaneous Ribbentrop affair and the baby talk correspondence with the king. The demented jealousy over Herman Rogers and the attempt to sabotage Lucy Wan. The on and on and on against Edward's family at 2 o'clock in the morning. These are the available evidence of the ruthless. They are real. Dr. Geyer Leinhardt called her cold, mean-spirited, a bully, and a sadist. Kenneth de Courcy described the on and on and on. Diana Cooper observed the board stiff with irritation and coldness on the Nalin. Cecil Beaton described her nearly driven mad, and the elegance grotesque in drunkenness. The ruthless is the accurate characterization. The ruthless is also the characterization that requires the honest context of the formation that produced it. The formation was the formation of the person who had been dependent on the caprice of others since the Blue Ridge Summit cottage where no one filed the birth certificate. The capricious provision of Uncle Sol, the sadistic provision of Win Spencer, the steady provision of Ernest that she had to manage herself out of because the steady provision had been superseded by the largest available management project. The ruthless was what the cheese-paring years had required of the person who survived them. The ruthless is not the exculpation. The ruthless is the thing. The thing had a formation. The formation does not excuse the thing, it explains it. On the never satisfied. This is the most accurate of the three characterizations. The never satisfied is the characterization that the full arc of the available life produces when the full arc is examined in its honest form. She was never satisfied. Not with Win Spencer, not with Ernest Simpson, not with Edward, not with the Duchess title, not with the HRH denial, not with the Nassau governorship, not with the circuit of houses and parties, not with the food she did not eat, not with the vodka from the silver tankards, not with the Jimmy Donahue affair, not with the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers, not with the Paris villa and the Maitre Bloom management and the changed will and the Institut Pasteur and the dementia. She said it herself. You have no idea how hard it is to live out a great romance. The hardness was the never satisfied's experience of the great romance. The great romance was supposed to have been the thing that the never satisfied required. The great romance had produced the exile. The exile had been the circuit and the vodka and the boredom. The boredom was the never satisfied's daily experience of the largest available management project. The never satisfied was what the formation had required. The cheese-paring years produced the person for whom the available thing is never the sufficient thing, because the sufficient thing was not available during the formation, and the formation organized the subsequent life around the not yet sufficient. The not yet sufficient was her entire life. The Oldfields School had been the not yet sufficient, in the form of the Uncle Sol provision, rather than the own provision. The Win Spencer marriage had been the not yet sufficient, in the form of the sadistic alcoholic. The China years had been the not yet sufficient, in the form of the person who was managing the available world in the direction of the sufficient, without the sufficient becoming available. Ernest Simpson had been the closest available form of the sufficient. She had managed him out of it because the largest available management project had appeared. The largest available management project had not been the sufficient. Herman Rogers had been the thing. Herman Rogers had married Lucy Wan. The never satisfied is the most honest of the three characterizations of the title. It is also the most sympathetic, if the sympathy is the sympathy of the person who understands the formation, rather than excuses the choices the formation produced. The Nazi Germany dimension requires the honest verdict. It cannot be managed into the historical footnote in the form that the romantic account has been managing it. The 17 carnations from Ribbentrop were not the romantic eccentricity of the German ambassador who had fallen for the woman who was managing the king. Ribbentrop was hanged at Nuremberg for crimes against humanity. The 17 carnations were the daily accounting of the 17 specific occasions. The dinner party comments were not the tactless social observations of the person who had not fully thought through the implications. The world would have been a better place if Jews were exterminated, is not the tactless observation. It is the genocidal statement, delivered at the dinner table to the horrified guests who reported it to Andrew Morton. The Nazi Germany dimension is the dimension that the honest verdict cannot explain through the formation. The acquisitive streak from the cheese-paring years does not explain the dinner-table genocidal statement. The ruthless from the Win Spencer years does not explain the flirtation with Hitler. The never satisfied from the $60 a month does not explain the 17 carnations from the man who was organizing the Holocaust's diplomatic architecture. The Nazi Germany dimension is the dimension that the formation cannot account for in the form that the honest accounting requires. It is the dimension of the moral choice rather than the formation's product. The moral choice was the choice to be in that room, to make those statements, to accept those carnations, to give those salutes. She made the choice. The formation produced the choices that the formation accounts for. The Nazi Germany dimension was the choice that the formation does not account for. The honest verdict is this. Wallis Simpson was grasping in the specific form that the cheese-paring years produced the acquisitive streak in the person who survived them. She was ruthless in the specific form that the active management of the available world requires the ruthless as the organizing principle, when the ruthless is the only available management tool. She was never satisfied in the specific form that the formation organized the not yet sufficient as the permanent condition of the available life. She was also the person who made the specific moral choices that the Nazi Germany dimension represents. The formation accounts for the grasping and the ruthless and the never satisfied. The formation does not account for the 17 carnations and the dinner table genocidal statements. She was both. The formation and the choice, the grasping and the dinner table, the never satisfied and the Berchtesgaden tea, the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers and the salute in the German photograph. Both were Wallis Simpson. Both are in the available record. What the available record also contains is the specific, honest assessment of what the institution did with Wallis Simpson. It denied her the HRH. It declined to attend the wedding. It called her that woman for 66 years. It managed her into the exile and kept her in the exile and buried her at Frogmore without the HRH when the exile was over. It also produced the abdication crisis by having on the throne a man who was unfit for the throne and who had been telling his mistress 11 years before the abdication that he needed the cruelty. The institution produced Edward VIII. Edward VIII produced the abdication. The abdication required Wallis. The institution then managed Wallis as the cause of the abdication. The institution produced the conditions. Wallis made the most of the conditions. The most was what the grasping and the ruthless and the never satisfied and the cheese-paring years and Uncle Sol and the $60 a month and the China years and the Bill Spencer and Ernest Simpson and the Prince of Wales and the 17 carnations and the Berchtesgaden tea and the denied HRH and the Frogmore burial without the HRH had produced as the most. The most was not enough. It never was. Me. The honest verdict on Wallis Simpson requires one dimension that the 8 preceding parts have been assembling toward, but have not yet directly examined. The dimension is the historical dimension. The specific question of what the abdication of Edward VIII actually did to Britain and to the course of the 20th century, and to the specific people whose lives the abdication reorganized around its consequences. The abdication was not merely the personal crisis of the king who loved the wrong woman. It was the constitutional event that reorganized the line of succession, the monarchy's public image, the specific individuals who occupied the throne across the most consequential decade of the century, and, through those reorganizations, the available history of the world. This is not the exaggeration. This is the specific accounting. Edward VI became king on the 20th of January 1936, on the death of his father George V. He reigned for 326 days. He abdicated on the 11th of December 1936. 326 days. The shortest reign of a British monarch since Lady Jane Grey, in 1553. Lady Jane Grey had been executed. Edward had been managed out by the institution, and the Prime Minister, and the Archbishop of Canterbury, and his own constitutionally impossible desire to marry the twice-divorced American woman. 326 days. What those 326 days told about the specific character of the king was the account that the biographers who have examined them have been producing ever since. Philip Ziegler's authorized biography described a man who was charming and charismatic and spectacularly unfit for the throne. The unfit was not the unfit of the person who had been insufficiently trained. It was the unfit of the person whose specific character had been producing the evidence of the unfitness across the decades of the Prince of Wales, and whose unfitness the abdication had provided the specific occasion for the institution to manage in the form of the management. The management was the abdication. The abdication was the institution removing from the throne the person whose presence on the throne was the problem, and replacing the problem with the available solution. The available solution was George VI. Albert Frederick Arthur George, Bertie, to his family, had not been prepared to be king. He had the stutter. He had the temperament of the second son, whose formation had been the formation of the person who is not the heir, and who knows he is not the heir, and whose formation has organized itself around the not being the heir, in the specific form that the second son's formation organizes, when the second son is the second son of the King of Great Britain. He was shy. He was anxious. He was devoted to his wife Elizabeth, and to his two daughters, Margaret and Elizabeth. He became king because his brother abdicated. The abdication was the mechanism that produced the king, who was not supposed to be king, and who was, by the available evidence of the subsequent decades, a considerably better king than the brother who had abdicated to avoid being king. The considerably better king's specific quality was tested in the specific form that the considerably better king's quality is best tested, which was the Second World War. George VI remained in London during the Blitz. He visited the bombed areas. He broadcast to the nation. He was, in the specific language of the wartime symbol, the king who stayed when the king who had abdicated had been managed to the Bahamas and had been the subject of the Operation Willy Puppet King scenario, and had been telling the German ambassador that he thought Britain was likely to lose. The king who stayed and the king who had abdicated were the same dynasty. The abdication had determined which one was on the throne, when the determination was the determination that mattered most in the history of the 20th century. Britain was led through the Second World War by the king who stayed. The king who stayed was on the throne because the king who had not been the king stayed had been managed off the throne by the abdication crisis. The abdication crisis had been produced by Wallis Simpson. Not entirely, the crisis had been produced by Edward's obsession and the institution's management of the obsession, and the Prime Minister's assessment of the available options, and the Archbishop of Canterbury's position on the divorced remarriage, and the specific convergence of the constitutional machinery that the crisis had been assembling since Edward's accession in January 1936. But Wallis had been the specific occasion. Noel Coward, the playwright and social observer who moved through the same social world as the Windsors, and who was among the wittier available observers of the period, said that every town in England should erect a statue to Wallis Simpson. The Coward assessment was the assessment of the person who had understood the specific historical dimension of the abdication, that the removal of Edward VIII from the throne had been the management of the person whose presence on the throne during the Second World War would have been the presence of the person who thought Britain was likely to lose the war and who believed he might have a role to play. The role he believed he might have to play was the puppet king role. The puppet king role was the role that the Operation Willy scenario had been organized around making available. The Operation Willy scenario required a defeated Britain. A defeated Britain required a king who could be presented as the available British sovereign for the accommodation rather than the resistance. Edward was the available king. George VI was the king who made the accommodation unavailable by being the king who stayed and who led the resistance. Every town in England should erect a statue. The coward assessment is the assessment from one specific angle of the historical dimension. There is another angle. The other angle is the angle of the people whose lives the abdication reorganized in the specific form that the abdication of a king reorganizes the lives of the people who are reorganized by it. George VI's life was reorganized by the abdication. He had not wanted to be king. He wept for an hour when he was told. He became king because his brother had abdicated for the woman for whom the abdication was the largest available management project. He was king from 1936 until his death in February 1952. He died at 56 years old. The doctors cited the specific combination of the lung cancer and the arteriosclerosis and the specific physical deterioration of the person who had been carrying the specific stress of the wartime sovereign across the years of the war, and whose physical constitution had not been the physical constitution of the person who was going to live to an old age in the available circumstances. He died at 56. His daughter Elizabeth became queen at 25. Elizabeth II was 25 years old when she became queen. She had not expected to become queen. Her uncle's abdication had produced the succession that produced her father's reluctant reign, that produced her own reign at 25. She reigned until her death in September 2022, 70 years, the longest reign of any British monarch in the available record. The 70-year reign was the reign produced by the abdication. The abdication was produced by Wallis. The 70-year reign is part of the accounting of what Wallis Simpson's management of the available world produced as the historical consequence. The Queen Mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, the wife of the reluctant king who had wept for an hour and who had died at 56, lived until 2002. She was 101 years old at her death. She had maintained the That Woman designation for 66 years. She had received Wallis at Buckingham Palace for the funeral of the man the abdication had put on the throne. She had outlived Wallis by 16 years. The That Woman outlived by 16 years. The 66 years of the That Woman and the 16 more. Queen Elizabeth II's reign had been the specific product of the abdication's chain of consequences. The abdication had produced George VI. George VI had produced Elizabeth II's accession at 25. Elizabeth II's accession at 25 had produced the 70-year reign. The 70-year reign had produced the specific quality of the constitutional monarchy's stability across the second half of the 20th century that the constitutional monarchy had not been certain, in December 1936, it was going to have available to produce. The chain of consequences from the Blue Ridge Summit Cottage in June 1896 to the royal burial ground at Frogmore in April 1986 had included a king's abdication and a century's constitutional crisis and a world war's leadership question and a 70-year reign and the puppet king scenario that had not been realized, and the title That Woman maintained for 66 years, and the 17 carnations from the man who was hanged at Nuremberg. It had included all of this. Noel Coward said, every town should erect a statue. The statue would be the statue of the woman who had made the abdication available by being the available occasion of the obsession of the person who needed the cruelty and who had found it in the person whose formation had produced the cruelty as the active management of the available world. The statue would also have to account for the 17 carnations and the Berchtesgaden tea and the dinner table genocidal statements and the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers and the never satisfied and the me. The statue is not built anywhere. There is no statue of Wallis Simpson in any town in England. There is the grave at Frogmore beside Edward. The institution that called her that woman and denied her the HRH buried her in the royal burial ground beside the man who had abdicated for her. The royal burial ground is the institution's final management of the available person in the form of the burial rather than the statue. The burial is the management. The statue is the honest accounting. The honest accounting is what this account has been producing across its 9 parts. Me. First words. Royal burial ground. No HRH. No statue. 90 years. The largest available management project produced the largest available constitutional consequence. The consequence reorganized the throne for 70 years. The throne that was reorganized is the throne that the largest available management project had not managed toward. The accounting is the accounting of the woman who managed everything and produced everything except the thing she actually wanted, which was Herman Rogers, who married Lucy Wan. Bessie Wallis Warfield was born in a cottage in Pennsylvania in June 1896, where nobody filed the birth certificate. She died in a Paris villa in April 1986, where her lawyer had been managing the isolation of her final years. Between the unrecorded birth and the managed death were 90 years of the most consequential management of the available world that the available world had produced in the specific form of a woman from Baltimore whose first words had been, me. The me requires the honest final accounting. What the me produced, assembled from the 9 preceding parts, is the following. 3 husbands, a German ambassador sending 17 carnations whose number was the specific accounting of the occasions, a king's abdication, a constitutional crisis, the largest available management project in the available world, the exile, the Bahamas, the Nazi Germany tour, the Berchtesgaden tea, and the flirtation with Hitler that Hitler declined, the dinner table genocidal statements, the 17 carnations from the man who was hanged at Nuremberg, the circuit of houses and parties, the vodka from the silver tankards, the anorexia, the extraordinary food she did not eat, the Jimmy Donahue affair, the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers, the on and on against Edward's family at 2 o'clock in the morning, the denied HRH pursued across 35 years, the dementia, the isolation of Maître Blum, the changed will, the Institut Pasteur, and on the other side of the accounting, a king removed from the throne who would have been the puppet king candidate of Operation Villi, a reluctant king installed in his place who led Britain through the Second World War from London, while the former king was in the Bahamas, thinking Britain would lose. A 70-year reign produced from the abdication's chain of consequences. A constitutional monarchy stabilized across the second half of the 20th century. Both sides of the accounting are real. Both are the products of the me. The honest final verdict requires the honest statement of what Wallis Simpson was. She was not the scheming seductress of the hostile account. The scheming seductress of the hostile account is the villain of the simple narrative, the American temptress who arrived in London with the specific intention of seducing the king and who executed the seduction with the specific ruthlessness of the person who had planned it from the beginning. This is not what happened. She had been managing the available world in the available directions since the cheese-paring years, and the king had appeared in the available world as the largest available management project. She had not planned the king. The king had arrived. She was not the victim of the sympathetic revision either. The victim of the sympathetic revision is the woman who was trapped by Edward's obsessive neediness and who had genuinely wanted to escape and who had been denied the escape by the institution's management of the situation in the form that the institution's management produced. This is also not entirely what happened. She had been at the window of Buckingham Palace, grinning like a good-time girl with a new diamond. She had been conducting the Ribbentrop affair simultaneously. She had made the dinner table genocidal statements. She was not simply the trapped woman who wanted to escape. She was the specific person that the 9 parts have assembled from the available evidence. The person whose first words were me, and whose formation in the cheese-paring years had produced the acquisitive streak and the ruthless management and the never satisfied and the active management of the available world in the direction of the maximum available things. The maximum available thing was the king. The king was also the person whose formation had organized him around the need for the cruelty. He had told his mistress in 1920 that he needed it. He found it in the person whose formation had produced the cruelty as the available management tool. The cruelty and the need for the cruelty met at the Bryanston Court dinner table in January 1931 and produced the 35 years and the abdication and the exile and the constitutional crisis and the 70-year reign. Two formations met. The meeting produced the history. What the history produced for Wallis Simpson personally was not the thing she had managed toward. She had managed toward the status and the provision and the secure attachment. The status she had in the Duchess title, without the HRH. The provision she had in the estate, and the jewelry and the villa. The secure attachment she had pursued in the form of Herman Rogers, who had married Lucy Wan. She never got the secure attachment. The king was the largest available management project. The largest available management project was not the secure attachment. The secure attachment was the thing she had been managing toward since the cottage in Blue Ridge Summit, where nobody filed the birth certificate, and the father died of tuberculosis at 5 months, and the available world declined to provide the secure attachment in the available form. The $60 a month from Uncle Sol was the available form of the secure attachment's decline to provide. The Wynne-Spencer marriage was the available form of the secure attachment's production of the sadistic alcoholic. The China years were the available management of the absence of the secure attachment. The Ernest Simpson marriage was the closest available form, and she managed herself out of it. The king was the largest available form, and she managed him into the exile. Herman Rogers was the actual form, and he married Lucy Wan. She was never satisfied, because she was never provided with the thing the never satisfied required. The thing the never satisfied required was the thing that the cottage in Blue Ridge Summit had declined to provide at the beginning, and that the subsequent 90 years had declined to provide in the forms they declined to provide it in. The formation was the explanation. The formation was not the exculpation. The Ribbentrop affair was not the formation's product. The Berchtesgaden tea was not the formation's product. The dinner table genocidal statements were not the formation's product. The 17 carnations from the man who was hanged at Nuremberg were the moral choices of the person who made them in the specific context of the 1930s European political situation, where other choices were available and were made by other people who had access to the same available situation. She made those choices. The formation explains the grasping and the ruthless and the never satisfied. The formation does not explain those specific choices in the form that the honest accounting requires them to be accounted for. The institution did not erect the statue. Noel Coward said every town should erect one. No town has. The institution buried her at Frogmore beside Edward and denied her the HRH in the burial, as it had denied her the HRH in the life. The denied HRH and the royal burial ground at Frogmore. Both simultaneously. The management of the available situation in the form that the management produces when the management is the simultaneous provision of the royal burial ground and the denial of the HRH. She is at Frogmore. Edward is beside her. He called her Freddie Weedy and wrote to her in baby talk and told her, "Your own little David is queeing so hard inside," and gave up the most powerful throne in the world. She was bored stiff with him on the Narlin in August 1936. She would have grabbed Herman Rogers and told the Duke to go. The Duke is at Frogmore. She is at Frogmore. Herman Rogers died in 1954. Lucy Wan survived him. Lucy got what Wallis wanted. Me, Bessie Wallis Warfield, born June 1896, in a cottage where no one filed the birth certificate. First words, me, died April 1986, in the Paris villa, buried at Frogmore, beside the king who abdicated for her. Without the HRH she pursued for 35 years. Without the Herman Rogers, she would have grabbed the Duke to get. Without the statue that Noel Coward said every town should erect. Without the thing she actually wanted. That is the last word on the woman who was grasping, ruthless, and never satisfied. The last word is not the condemnation, and it is not the rehabilitation. The last word is the honest accounting of the formation, and the choices, and the management, and the thing she managed toward, and the thing she never managed to get. The last word is me, and it was never enough. Edward had demanded that the jewelry be destroyed after her death. This is the biographical detail about the jewelry collection that the auction's subsequent history has preserved as the detail that most precisely establishes the specific quality of Edward's possessive attachment to Wallis across the 35 years of the exile. The demand that the things he had given her should not be worn by any other woman after she died, that the collection should be dismantled, that the physical objects of the devotion should not outlast the person the devotion had been organized around. He did not get his way. Nobody obeyed the demand. In April 1987, 1 year after Wallis died, Sotheby's erected a large tent outside the Beau Rivage Hotel on the shores of Lake Geneva. The tent was required because the available rooms of the Beau Rivage were insufficient for the scale of the event. The event attracted 1,000 bidders. It attracted 300 members of the media. It was described by the press as the sale of the century. The sale of the century was organized around 214 pieces of jewelry. 87 of them were by Cartier, 23 were by Van Cleef and Arpels. The rest were the accumulation of the 40 years of the circuit, the 40 years of the exile during which Edward had been giving Wallis the jewelry in the form that the man who could not give her the HRH and could not give her the crown gives the woman who cannot have the HRH and cannot have the crown. He gave her what he could give her. What he could give her was the jewelry. Henry Chips Channon had observed the giving in 1936, before the abdication. He had written in his diary, "The king must give her new jewels every day. He worships her." The Cartiers are resetting magnificent, indeed fabulous jewels for Wallis. And for what purpose if she is not to be queen? For what purpose if she is not to be queen? The purpose, which the 1987 Sotheby's auction made visible in the form that the $53.5 million total made visible, was the purpose of the alternative. The jewelry was the alternative crown. She could not have the crown. She could not have the HRH. She could have the jewelry. She had the jewelry. She had 214 pieces. 87 of them were Cartier. The collection had been described, by the people who had observed it across the exile years, as the alternative crown jewels, the private collection that the exiled Duchess had assembled in the place of the crown jewels she would have worn if the institution had permitted the crown to be available. The institution had not permitted the crown to be available. The institution had the crown jewels. Wallis had the alternative crown jewels. The alternative crown jewels were the jewelry of the exile, the specific accumulation that the denied HRH and the denied crown had organized Edward's giving around in the form of the available alternative. The pre-sale estimate for the 1987 auction was $7.5 million. The sale realized $53.5 million, 7 times the estimate. The specific multiple of 7 times the estimate is the specific number that the Sotheby's president, John Marion, explained in the terms of the unique outpouring of nostalgia that the collection had produced in the bidding room and among the 1,000 bidders in the tent outside the Beau Rivage. The nostalgia was the nostalgia for the story, not merely the nostalgia for the jewelry. The jewelry was extraordinary. It was the jewelry of the exile's 40 years of Cartier and Van Cleef and Arpels. It was the jewelry of the panther bracelet and the flamingo clip and the W.E. heart brooch. The jewelry was the jewelry. But the nostalgia that 7 times the estimate produced was the nostalgia for the story the jewelry told. The story of the king who had given up everything and who had given her the jewelry instead of the everything he had given up. And the jewelry was the physical record of the story in the form that the physical record takes when the physical record is the jewelry. Elizabeth Taylor was in the tent. She bought the Prince of Wales brooch for $623,000. It was the first significant piece of jewelry she had ever bought for herself. This is the biographical detail that the accounts of the sale have preserved as the Taylor detail. The woman who was arguably the most glamorous available woman of the 20th century had found, in the Sotheby's tent outside the Beau Rivage, the specific occasion for the first significant jewelry purchase she had made for herself. The occasion was Wallis Simpson's collection. Elizabeth Taylor had been friends with the Duke and Duchess during the exile years. She had visited the villa. She had sat at the table with the extraordinary food that Wallis did not eat. She had admired the Prince of Wales brooch during the visits. When the brooch went under the hammer in 1987, Taylor bid on it for the reason that the Taylor bid expressed when it expressed itself at $623,000. The sentimental reason of the friend, who wanted the thing the friend had admired in the visits to the villa. She got it. When Taylor died in 2011, the brooch went under the hammer again, at Christie's, as part of the Taylor jewelry collection. It sold for $1,314,500. The Prince of Wales brooch that Wallis had worn and Taylor had bought at $623,000 was worth $1,314,500 24 years later. The brooch of the woman who could not be queen and the brooch of the actress who was the closest available alternative royalty of the 20th century had doubled in value in the 24 years between the two deaths. The Cartier Panther bracelet sold at the 1987 auction for $1.27 million. In 2010, 23 years later, it sold again at Sotheby's for £4.5 million. The bracelet that Wallis had worn on the circuit and at the parties and in the photographs of the elegance grotesque in drunkenness had appreciated in the specific form that the objects of the exile's story appreciate, when the exile's story is the story that the available world continues to find the most significant available romantic story of the 20th century. The romance that was not the romance Wallis had wanted, the romance she would have abandoned for Herman Rogers if Herman Rogers had not married Lucy Wan. The jewelry had been her alternative. The alternative had been the best available thing in the specific form that the best available thing is the best available thing when the best available thing is the alternative to the thing you cannot have. She could not have the crown. She could not have Herman Rogers. She could not have the HRH. She could have the jewelry. She had the jewelry, and when she died, the lawyer who had been managing her isolation had organized the changed will so that the jewelry's proceeds went to the Institut Pasteur, the Institute for the Scientific Research, not to the friends who had been turned away from the door, not to the social world of the circuit, not to the people whose presence in her life had been the presence of the circuit's people, to the Institut Pasteur. There is a specific quality to the Institut Pasteur as the beneficiary that the honest account requires to notice. The Institut Pasteur is the institution whose work is the work of the scientific management of the available world, in the direction of the prevention and the treatment of the diseases that the available world produces. The Institut Pasteur manages the diseases. The available world's diseases have included the tuberculosis that killed Wallis's father when she was 5 months old in the Blue Ridge Summit cottage, where no one filed the birth certificate. Her father died of tuberculosis. The jewelry's proceeds went to the Institut Pasteur. The institution whose work includes the tuberculosis research received the proceeds of the collection that had been given to her by the man who could not give her the crown. Whether Maître Blum's management of the will had produced the Institut Pasteur as the beneficiary through the specific deliberate management of the available change, or whether Wallis herself had wanted the Institut Pasteur, was the question that the isolation of the final years prevented from being the question whose answer was available. The question is not available. The Institut Pasteur received the proceeds. The proceeds were $53.5 million against an estimate of $7.5 million, 7 times the estimate. The jewelry had been the alternative crown. The alternative crown had been sold. The proceeds of the alternative crown had gone to the Institut Pasteur. The Institut Pasteur had received the 40 years of the exile's jewelry, the 87 Cartier pieces, and the 23 Van Cleef & Arpels pieces and the rest, in the form of the $53.5 million that the sale of the century had produced, in the tent outside the Beau Rivage on the shores of Lake Geneva. The alternative crown jewels of the woman who could not be queen had produced, in their dispersal, the specific scientific research funding of one of the world's most significant available research institutions. The jewels of a woman who had been denied the royal title ended by endowing one of the world's leading biomedical research institutions. This is the closing observation of the scholar who examined the 1987 sale's specific legacy, the specific irony of the denied HRH and the denied crown, producing the scientific research endowment in the form of the $53.5 million. She had been denied the crown. The alternative to the crown had funded the research. The research funded the science. The science managed the diseases. The diseases included the tuberculosis that had killed the father she never knew. Me. First words. The father who died at 5 months. The Uncle Sol who left $60 a month. The jewelry that 7 times the estimate produced. The Institut Pasteur that the jewelry's proceeds endowed. The tuberculosis that killed the father whose death had organized the cheese-paring years that had produced the acquisitive streak, that had produced the jewelry that funded the research into the disease that had killed him. The circle had closed. The alternative crown jewels had closed it. She is at Frogmore. The jewelry is dispersed. The Institut Pasteur has the proceeds. Edward is beside her at Frogmore. He had wanted the jewelry destroyed. Nobody obeyed. The jewelry was the alternative crown. The alternative crown was sold. The sale produced the science. The science includes the tuberculosis research. The tuberculosis killed the father. The father's death produced the formation. The formation produced everything else. The circle is the accounting. Wallis Simpson died in April 1986. In the 40 years since her death, the British monarchy has managed the marriages of Charles and Diana, Charles and Camilla, Andrew and Sarah Ferguson, Harry and Meghan, and the various additional complications that the management of the royal family's membership produces as the available complications. In the 40 years since her death, the specific questions that her story raised about the institution's management of the outsider woman, about the monarch's personal desires against the constitutional requirements, about the American woman in the British royal world, have been raised again in different forms by different people. The institution has not resolved any of them. It has managed them. The managing is what the institution does. The Crown examined Wallis in its 4th and 5th seasons. The Netflix dramatization of the royal family's modern history had been the most significant available popular cultural engagement with the Wallis Simpson story for the contemporary audience, the audience that had not been alive during the abdication and for whom the specific historical weight of December 1936 was the historical weight of the event that the television dramatization was required to make available in the form that the dramatization makes available. The Crown's Wallis was played by Erin Doherty in one of the most constrained performances the show produced, constrained in the specific form of the dramatization that had been given the least available material to work with. Because the Wallis Simpson who is legible to the contemporary audience is the Wallis Simpson of the romantic version and the Wallis Simpson of the hostile version, and the specific middle ground between the two that the honest account requires is the middle ground that the dramatization's narrative requirements consistently resist. Madonna's W.E. came before The Crown. The 2011 film was the specific cultural engagement with the Wallis story that the available cultural tools of the 2011 moment produced. It was received, by the critics who reviewed it, as the engagement that had prioritized the sympathetic revision over the available honest account. The sympathetic revision was the revision that the contemporary moment's specific relationship to the Wallis story requires, when the contemporary moment is the moment that has identified in Wallis the available prototype of the woman who was punished by the institution for being the wrong kind of woman. The wrong kind of woman prototype is the prototype that the contemporary engagement with the Wallis story consistently deploys as the available frame. The frame is the frame of the woman who was American, who was divorced, who was not the right kind of person for the institution, and who was managed by the institution through the mechanisms of the denial and the exclusion and the that woman designation. The frame is not wrong. The institution did all of those things. The frame is also incomplete. The frame does not account for the 17 carnations, or the Berchtesgaden tea, or the dinner table genocidal statements. The incomplete frame produces the comparisons. The comparison to Meghan Markle has been the most sustained available comparison of the Wallis story to the contemporary royal story, both American, both divorced, both married into the institution in the circumstances that the institution found complicated, both managed by the institution in the direction of the not fully welcomed, both eventually outside the institution in the specific forms that the outside takes when the outside is the American woman who has been managed by the British royal family. The comparison is real in the dimensions in which the comparison is real. The institution's management of the American woman who married into it has produced similar mechanisms across the two stories. The title question, the inclusion question, the press management, the family's management of the available distance. The comparison fails in the dimensions in which the comparison fails. Meghan did not conduct an affair with the foreign minister of a genocidal regime while married to Harry. Meghan did not make dinner-table genocidal statements. The specific moral dimensions of the Wallis story are not the moral dimensions of the Meghan story, and the comparison that elides the moral dimensions in order to produce the cleanest available version of the prototype is the comparison that the honest accounting declines to produce in the eliding form. The Diana comparison is different. Diana was not American, and Diana was not the wrong kind of woman in the institutional sense. She was the right kind of woman who had been given the wrong marriage. The specific quality of the Diana comparison is the quality of the institution's management of the woman who was inside the institution and who was not receiving from the institution the marriage that the institution had presented to her as the marriage she was entering. Wallis was the outside cause of the wrong marriage's interior. Diana was the inside experience of the wrong marriage's exterior. The two women are the two available positions of the same institutional failure. The institutional failure was the failure to manage the king's personal desires in the direction of the institutional requirement before the personal desires had produced the wrong marriage in the form of the Diana marriage that had been required to compensate for the Wallis abdication. Edward had abdicated. George VI had been installed. George VI had produced the requirement that the heir marry well. The heir had married Diana in the specific form of the marriage that well required. Diana had experienced the inside of the requirement. Wallis had produced the outside cause of the requirement. The institution had produced both, the Wallis management and the Diana requirement. The Wallis management had produced the exile. The exile had produced the Diana requirement. The Diana requirement had produced Diana. Diana had produced the three of us in this marriage. The three of us in this marriage had produced the panorama interview. The panorama interview had produced the public accounting. The public accounting was the public accounting of the institution that had been managing its members' private lives since before Wallis, and that continues managing them now. What the 40 years since Wallis's death have added to the available picture of the specific mechanism of the institution's management is the specific evidence of the pattern. The pattern is the pattern of the institution that manages the available outsider through the mechanism of the title denial and the exclusion and the that woman designation and the not fully welcomed and the available distance. The pattern was the Wallis management. The pattern was the Sarah Ferguson management. The pattern was the Meghan management. The mechanisms vary. The institution denied Wallis the HRH. The institution gave Diana the HRH, and then denied it to the divorced Diana. The institution denied Sarah the HRH after the divorce. The institution allowed Meghan the HRH, and then Meghan and Harry removed themselves. The specific mechanism varies. The pattern is the pattern of the institution that manages the woman who does not fit the available institutional form through the mechanism of the not fittings management. The not fittings management is the institution's primary available tool for the person who is not the right kind of woman. The right kind of woman is the woman who has been produced by the institution's requirements in the form that the requirements produce the woman. Kate Middleton is the available contemporary example, the woman whose formation and whose specific quality of the managed public presence and whose navigation of the institution's requirements have produced, in the institution's assessment, the woman who fits the available form. Wallis did not fit the available form. The not fitting produced the management. The management produced the exile. The exile produced everything the exile produced. The biographies continue. The Anna Pasternak biography of 2019 produced the sympathetic revision. The Andrew Lowney Traitor King produced the damning account. Both are the accounts of the same person from the two available positions. The position of the person who examines the formation and finds the victim. The position of the person who examines the choices and finds the complicit. Both positions are partially accurate. Both positions are incomplete. The honest account requires both simultaneously, and the honest account is the account that the simultaneous production of both positions requires the patience to assemble from the available evidence. The available evidence is what this account has been assembling across its 12 parts. The assembling has produced the following picture of the person. A woman whose first words were me, me, and whose formation in the cheese-paring years had produced the acquisitive streak and the ruthless management and the never satisfied. A woman who had been married 3 times and who had conducted the Ribbentrop affair simultaneously with the King management. A woman who had made dinner-table genocidal statements and had tried to flirt with Hitler. A woman who had been demented with jealousy over Herman Rogers and who would have grabbed Herman and told the Duke to go. A woman who had managed the King into the abdication while simultaneously writing to him that they would create disaster together. A woman who had managed the exiles circuit with the extraordinary food she did not eat, and the vodka from the silver tankards, and the attempts to amuse the man who had nothing to do and no interests. A woman whose alternative crown jewels had sold at 7 times the estimate, and whose proceeds had funded the Institut Pasteur. A woman who was buried at Frogmore beside the king who had abdicated for her without the HRH she had pursued for 35 years. A woman who never got the thing she actually wanted, which was Herman Rogers, who married Lucy Wan. The 40 years since her death have not resolved the assessment. The assessment remains contested. The biographers are still arguing. The comparisons are still being made. The dramatizations are still being produced. The Bitter End, a biographical film written by Emerald Fennell, has been announced. It will explore Wallis's later years in Paris. The later years in Paris were the later years of the Metro Bloom management and the changed will and the isolation and the dementia. Emerald Fennell is the director who made Saltburn, the film about the acquisition of the aristocracy by the outsider who wants what the aristocracy has. The casting of Emerald Fennell as the writer of the Wallis Simpson film is the specific casting that the available cultural moment's relationship to the Wallis story produces when the available cultural moment identifies in the Wallis story the available material for the story of the outsider who wants what the institution has. The institution still has the crown. The woman who managed the king into the abdication is at Frogmore. The crown she could not have is at the Tower of London. Both remain in their positions, 40 years after her death. The honest account of Wallis Simpson requires the honest account of the institution that produced the conditions for Wallis Simpson. Not in the exculpatory sense, the institution's production of the conditions does not exculpate the choices that Wallis made in the conditions. The 17 carnations and the Berchtesgaden tea and the dinner-table genocidal statements were not the institution's production. They were her choices in the specific historical context of the available choices. The honest account of the institution is not the exculpation of the person. It is the account of the other party to the same story. The other party to the same story was the institution of the British monarchy as it existed in the specific form of the 1930s. The institution of the 1930s had produced Edward VIII in the specific form that the institution produces its heirs. The formation of the heir from the childhood in the specific conditions of the royal household that produces the specific qualities that the royal household's production of the heir generates as the available qualities. Edward had been produced with the specific qualities that the accounts of him have consistently identified, the charm and the charisma, and the specific variety of the childlike emotional constitution that the Tracy Borman assessment had characterized. The childlike when it came to women was not an accident of Edward's personal character that the institution had nothing to do with. It was the product of the institution's specific management of the heir's formation across the decades of the heir's production. Edward had been produced as the heir before he had been produced as the person. The heir's production had organized the person's available development in the direction of the heir's requirements rather than the person's requirements. The result was the person who was charming and charismatic and childlike. The specific production of the heir's formation in the person who had been formed as the heir before he had been allowed to be the person. The childlike when it came to women was the institution's production. Wallis was the childlike's available management. The institution had also produced the specific conditions in which the management was possible. The institution had produced the dinner party circuit of the 1930s British upper class, whose social world the managed household at Bryanston Court was organized around accessing. The institution had produced the social world that the well-run household accessed in the form of the guest list that included, in January 1931, the Prince of Wales. The institution's social world had produced the occasion of the meeting. The meeting had produced everything that followed. This is not the argument that the institution caused the abdication. The institution did not cause the abdication. Edward caused the abdication, through the specific obsession of the person whose formation had produced the obsession, as the available response to the person whose formation had produced the management as the available response to the obsession. Two formations met. The meeting produced the history. The institution had produced one of the formations. Edward's formation was the institution's production. What the institution then did with the history its production had generated was the management that the institution deploys when the history requires the management. The management was the management of Stanley Baldwin and the Archbishop of Canterbury Cosmo Lang and the palace's legal counsel and the specific institutional apparatus that the abdication crisis had assembled for the management of the available crisis. Anna Pasternak's sympathetic revision made a specific argument about the management's character. She argued that Stanley Baldwin and Cosmo Lang and the palace's people had specific institutional interests in the removal of Edward from the throne, that Edward was considered unfit, that the Wallis question was the available instrument for the removal of the unfit king, and that the management had deployed the Wallis question as the instrument for the removal, in the form that the instrument most conveniently available was deployed. The argument has evidence. Edward was unfit. The accounts of his unfitness are the accounts of his own conduct across the 326 days of the reign. The loose talk at dinner parties about German accommodation, the red boxes left lying around, the specific disregard for the constitutional requirements of the position. Cosmo Lang, the Archbishop, had identified the unfitness. Baldwin had identified the unfitness. The palace's people had identified the unfitness. Wallis was the available instrument. The instrument was deployed. The unfit king was managed off the throne. The management produced George VI. George VI produced the wartime leadership. The wartime leadership produced the resistance rather than the accommodation. The resistance produced the available history of the 20th century in the form it took, rather than the form the Operation Willy Puppet King scenario might have produced. The institution managed the crisis with the available instrument. The available instrument was Wallis Simpson. She was both the cause and the instrument, the cause of the crisis in the specific form of the obsession's object, and the instrument of the crisis's management in the specific form of the convenient available reason for the removal of the unfit king. She identified this herself. "I was the convenient tool in their hands to use to get rid of you," she wrote to Edward after the abdication. The tool identification is the identification of the person who has understood the specific character of her own position in the institutional management of the available crisis. She was the tool, she was also the person, both simultaneously. The institution used her as the tool and then managed her as the problem. The tool was the abdication, the problem was the 35 years of the exile's management. The management of the tool produced the exile. The exile was the management of the problem in the available form that the problem's management took when the problem was the former king and his wife, who could not be queen, and who had to be kept somewhere that was not the country whose throne the former king had abdicated. The Bahamas was the somewhere. Churchill had arranged the somewhere. The somewhere was the management of the problem in the form of the geographical distance from the available complications that the problem's proximity to Europe and to the German intelligence operation had been producing as the available complications. The institution managed the tool into the exile, and then managed the exile into the Bahamas, and then managed the Bahamas into the return to the circuit in 1945, when the war had been won, and the puppet king scenario had been rendered unavailable by the victory, and the former king and his wife could be permitted to return to the circuit without the specific security implications that the circuit during the wartime had been carrying. The management was continuous. The management was always continuous. The institution manages continuously. The management produces the available outcomes, and the available outcomes require the further management, and the further management produces the further available outcomes. The specific further available outcome that Wallis Simpson's management had produced for the institution by April 1986 was the institution that had been managing the specific complications of the Wallis question for 50 years, from the January 1931 dinner at Bryanston Court to the April 1986 death in the Paris villa. 55 years of the management of the Wallis question, from the first meeting to the death. The management had produced the burial at Frogmore. The management had produced the denied HRH, maintained across the 55 years. The management had produced the That Woman, maintained by the Queen Mother for 66 years, from the abdication to her own death in 2002. The management had produced the Queen's visit to the Villa Windsor in May 1972. The institution's head coming to the bedside of the dying former king in the Paris villa where the exile had been conducted, managing the relationship between the institution and the former king's death in the available form of the visit. The management had also produced, 40 years after the death, the continuing fascination with the story. The fascination is the available evidence of the story's specific power, the power of the story of the formation that produced the grasping and the ruthless, and the never-satisfied meeting the formation that produced the childlike, and the needy, and the cruelty-requiring, in the specific historical context of the 1930s British constitutional monarchy, and the rising fascism, and the available consequences that the meeting of the two formations produced. The story is the story of the two formations and the meeting, and the consequences. The institution was the available context of the meeting. The context had been the specific social world of the 1930s British upper class, whose dinner party circuit had produced the Bryanston Court household, and the guest list that included the Prince of Wales. The specific quality of the institution that the honest account of the Wallis Simpson story requires to be acknowledged is the quality that the institution's management of the crisis has consistently been managing in the direction of the not acknowledged. The not acknowledged quality is the quality of the institution that produced the Edward who needed the cruelty and then blamed the person who provided the cruelty for the consequences of the needing. Edward needed the cruelty. He had said so in 1920. He had found the cruelty in Wallis. The cruelty had produced the obsession. The obsession had produced the abdication. The abdication had produced the crisis. The crisis had produced the management. The management had produced the exile. The exile had produced the That Woman. The That Woman had been the institution's management of the responsibility for the crisis in the available form. The responsibility allocated to the person who had provided the cruelty rather than to the person who had required it. The person who had required the cruelty was the institution's heir. The institution had produced the heir. The heir's requiring of the cruelty was the institution's production in the specific form that the institution's formation of the heir produced the requiring. The institution allocated the responsibility to Wallis. The allocation was the management. The management was the That Woman, and the denied HRH, and the exile, and the non-attended wedding. The management was the institutional management of the responsibility for the crisis that the institution's own production of the childlike heir had generated. She was the tool, she was the problem, she was the That Woman, she was the responsible party for the crisis that the institution's own heir had required her to produce. This is not the exculpation, this is the honest accounting of the institution's role in the story that the institution has been managing as the story of the tool and the problem and the That Woman, rather than the story of the institution's production of the conditions that the tool and the problem and the That Woman required. The institution is still managing the story. It has been managing it for 90 years. On the 13th of December 1936, 2 days after the abdication, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Cosmo Gordon Lang, broadcast to the nation on BBC Radio. He had been the Archbishop of Canterbury since 1928. He was the head of the Church of England. The Church of England was the church whose specific position on the marriage of the twice-divorced woman to the king had been the position that the abdication crisis had been organized around. The Church of England did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses were still living. and the king's desire to marry the twice-divorced Wallis Simpson had been the king's desire to do the thing that the Church of England did not permit the king to do. Lang broadcast on the 13th of December. He had waited 2 days. The waiting had been the waiting of the person who was preparing the available statement in the available form that the statement required after the available crisis had produced the available outcome of the abdication. The statement was the condemnation. He said, in the broadcast that the available historical record has preserved as one of the most specifically personal attacks on a former sovereign ever delivered by a senior institutional figure in the public form of the BBC broadcast. He has sought his happiness in a manner inconsistent with the Christian principles of marriage, and within a social circle whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts and traditions of his people. Whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts and traditions of his people. The whose was the whose of Wallis Simpson. The social circle whose standards and ways of life were alien to all the best instincts was the social circle that Wallis had managed the Prince of Wales into across the years of the management. The Bryanston Court dinners and the Narlin cruise and the specific social world of the 1930s cosmopolitan wealthy class that the Bryanston Court household had been organized around accessing. Lang went further. He said, even more strange and sad it is that he should have sought his happiness in a manner inconsistent with the Christian principles of marriage, and within a social circle whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts and traditions of his people. In the darkness of this hour, there is a voice from on high, saying, as it were, give me your heart, give me your heart. The broadcast produced immediate and significant public reaction. Not the reaction of the endorsement, the reaction of the fury. The British public, which had been managing its own complex feelings about the abdication across the crisis, received the Archbishop's condemnation of the former king in the specific register of the person who has been told what to feel by the authority and who has decided that the authority's telling is not the feeling they are having. John Betjeman, the poet, wrote a response that the period has preserved as the most precise available expression of the public's reaction to the Lang broadcast. He wrote, my Lord Archbishop, what a scold you are, and when your man is down, how bold you are. Of Christian charity how scant you are, and old lang swine, how full of cant you are, old lang swine. The specific quality of the public's reception of the Archbishop's condemnation, in the form of the Betjeman verse, is the quality of the public that understood the condemnation as the institutional management of the crisis, in the available form of the religious authority's specific condemnation of the person the institution had identified as the convenient target for the condemnation. Lang's specific condemnation of the social circle was the condemnation of Wallis, without naming Wallis. She was the social circle. She was the standards and ways of life alien to all the best instincts. She was the whom the Archbishop had identified as the whose. The condemnation was the institutional condemnation of the tool in the specific religious form that the head of the Church of England deploys when the head of the Church of England is deploying the condemnation in the religious form. She was living in France when the broadcast was made. She was at the villa of Wallis's friends Herman and Catherine Rogers in Cannes, managing the aftermath of the abdication in the specific form of the long telephone calls to Austria about finances and status. She heard the broadcast. She said afterward, it was as though I'd committed some horrible murder. It was very hard. The horrible murder characterization was the characterization of the person who had received the Archbishop's condemnation in the form of the BBC broadcast in the French villa, and who had understood the condemnation in the specific register of the person who has been publicly convicted of the crime without having been tried. The crime was being Wallis Simpson. The conviction was the Archbishop's broadcast. The broadcast was Lang's management of the available crisis. Lang had his own institutional interests in the management. His interest was the interest of the head of the Church of England in the position of the Church of England on the marriage of the twice-divorced woman to the monarch, the specific institutional interest of the organization whose stated principles the crisis had organized around, and whose authority the crisis had been testing in the form that the test of the Church of England's authority on the marriage question takes when the monarch wants to marry the person the Church says he cannot marry. The monarch had abdicated rather than not marry. The abdication had resolved the crisis in the form that the resolution required. The king who would not comply was replaced by the king who would comply. The church's position had been maintained. The authority had been maintained. Lang's broadcast had been the available form of the maintenance. The religious condemnation that told the nation that the abdication had been the right outcome, and that the social circle whose standards and ways of life were alien to the best instincts was the social circle that had produced the wrong outcome that the abdication had corrected. Stanley Baldwin managed the political dimension. Baldwin was the Prime Minister. He had been managing the Wallis question from the moment that the king's intention to marry her had been made clear to the government in October 1936. The management had been the management of the constitutional machinery, the conversations with the king about the available options, the communications with the dominions about the constitutional implications, the specific coordination of the institutional apparatus that the crisis required to be coordinated. Baldwin's management of the crisis has been assessed by the available historians in the assessments that the available historians produce, when the assessments are the assessments of the Prime Minister's management of the most significant constitutional crisis of the 20th century. The assessments vary in the specific dimension of Baldwin's motivation. The more sympathetic assessments are the assessments of the Prime Minister, who managed an impossible situation with the available tools and produced the available outcome of the abdication in the form that the available outcome required. The less sympathetic assessments are the assessments of the Prime Minister, who had specific institutional interests in the removal of the king, who was considered unfit, and who deployed the Wallis question as the available instrument for the removal. The specific evidence that the less sympathetic assessment requires is the evidence of Baldwin's assessment of Edward's fitness for the throne. The evidence exists. Baldwin had assessed Edward as unfit, not in the public statement, but in the private communications that the available historical record has made accessible in the form of the private communications. The assessment was the assessment of the Prime Minister, who had been watching the king's conduct across the 326 days of the reign, and who had identified in the conduct the specific evidence of the unfitness. The unfitness and the Wallis question were the two available instruments. The Wallis question was the more usable instrument because the Wallis question was the constitutional question, the marriage of the twice-divorced woman to the head of the Church of England, which was the question whose constitutional character gave the Prime Minister and the Archbishop and the palace's legal counsel the specific available authority to manage the crisis in the form of the constitutional authority rather than the political opinion. The constitutional authority was the available authority. The political opinion would have been the Prime Minister's opinion that the king was unfit. The constitutional authority was the Church of England's position on the remarriage of the divorced person. The Church's position gave the crisis the constitutional character that the political opinion alone could not have given. Tommy Lascelles was Edward's private secretary. He was the specific institutional insider whose role in the abdication crisis has been the role that the institutional insider's management of the crisis from the inside of the court's management apparatus produces. He had been watching Edward's conduct from closer than Baldwin, and from the specific inside position of the private secretary, who is in the rooms and the corridors and the daily institutional life of the sovereign. Lascelles had written a memorandum, the specific document that the institutional insider produces when the institutional insider has identified in the available situation the situation requiring the formal documentation of the assessment. The memorandum had been the memorandum of the person who had concluded that the king was unfit, and who was producing the available documentation of the unfitness for the available institutional record. He had also spoken to Baldwin directly. He had communicated the assessment in the private form that the private secretary communicates the assessment to the Prime Minister in the specific form that the private form of the communication between the court's insider and the government's head takes. The communication had been the communication of the institutional insider's assessment of the institutional head's unfitness to the person whose political authority made the assessment relevant to the available management. The three men, Lang, Baldwin, Lascelles, were the three primary available managers of the abdication crisis from the institutional side. They had their own interests. Lang had the church's authority to maintain. Baldwin had the political assessment of the unfit king. Lascelles had the daily observation of the specific unfitness. All three of their interests converged in the available instrument of the Wallis question. The Wallis question was the constitutional question. The constitutional question gave all three of them the available authority to manage the crisis in the direction of the available outcome. The available outcome was the abdication. The abdication was managed in the form that the constitutional question, deployed by the three available managers with their three sets of institutional interests, could produce. Wallis was the constitutional question. The constitutional question was managed. The management produced the abdication. The abdication produced everything. She had called herself the convenient tool. The assessment was accurate, in the specific sense that the convenient tool is accurate as the assessment of the person who has understood the specific character of their own position in the institutional management of the available crisis. She was the tool. She was also the person who had made the choices that made her available as the tool. Lang condemned her on the BBC. Baldwin managed the constitutional machinery. Lascelles documented the unfitness. All three deployed the available instrument. The instrument was Wallis Simpson. The instrument had first words of me. The instrument had been to Berchtesgaden. The instrument had made the dinner table genocidal statements. The instrument had conducted the Ribbentrop affair. The instrument had also been the person in the French villa, listening to the Archbishop's broadcast and saying it was as though she had committed some horrible murder. The tool and the murder. The instrument and the person. The convenient and the condemned. All of it was Wallis Simpson. The institution managed it. The management produced the exile. The exile produced the circuit. The circuit produced the vodka from the silver tankards, and the anorexia, and the boredom, and the Jimmy Donahue affair, and the demented jealousy over Herman Rogers. Lang broadcast on the 13th of December 1936. The broadcast lasted several minutes. The exile lasted 35 years. The British press had known about Wallis Simpson for years. Not months, years. The relationship between the Prince of Wales and the married American woman had been the open secret of the connected social world of the 1930s British upper class. And the connected social world of the 1930s British upper class included the editors and the proprietors of the newspapers who were managing the British press's coverage of the Prince of Wales, in the specific form that the British press managed the coverage of the Prince of Wales in 1936. The specific form was the not reporting. The not reporting was the available management of the information in the specific way that the British press of the 1930s managed the information about the private lives of the royal family, through the self-imposed constraint of the not reporting that the press's relationship to the palace had been organizing around since before the First World War. The palace provided the access. The press published the official version. The bargain was the bargain of the two institutions whose interests had aligned in the direction of the managed account rather than the available account. The available account was the Wallis account. The available account had been available for years. The British press did not report it. The American press did. The European press did. The foreign correspondents in London whose newspapers had no relationship with the palace's managed account were publishing the Wallis account in the American and European papers from the mid-1930s. British tourists and travellers who returned from abroad came back with the foreign newspapers that contained the Wallis account in the available form that the foreign newspapers' publication had produced. The British public was not entirely in the dark. The specific British people who had the access to the foreign press had the access to the account. The specific British people who read only the British press did not. The self-imposed constraint was the management of the available information in the available institutional form. It was also the management that the specific character of the British establishment's relationship to the inconvenient produces when the inconvenient is the information that the establishment has decided requires the management rather than the disclosure. The establishment had decided the Wallis information required the management. The management was the not reporting. The not reporting was the British press's management of the available account, in the form that the available account required, in the available form of the not reporting. When the crisis became public in December 1936, when the abdication was the imminent event rather than the managed possibility, The British public received the information in the form that the not reporting had been preventing from being the information. The information arrived suddenly and completely, and in the form of the constitutional crisis, rather than the gradual disclosure that the not reporting had been preventing from being the gradual disclosure. The British public's reaction was the reaction of the people who have received the sudden and complete information about the private life of the sovereign in the form of the constitutional crisis. The reaction was complex. It was not the simple reaction of the unified public receiving the unified account in the unified form. It was the complex reaction of the class-divided society receiving the account through the specific filters of the class-divided society's relationship to the monarchy. The working class was not uniformly hostile to Edward. The accounts of the public reaction from the working class areas of Britain, the mining towns, the industrial cities, the specific geography of the areas that Edward had visited during his tours of the depressed regions, and where he had made his famous statement that something must be done, were the accounts of the public that had identified in Edward the specific quality of the prince who saw them. Something must be done. He had said it in the depressed areas. He had been the prince who visited the depressed areas and who had said something must be done. The working class that had received the something must be done was not the working class that was uniformly enthusiastic about the management of the abdication that the establishment was producing. The specific quality of the working class reaction included the specific dimension of the reaction against the establishment's management, the reaction of the people who had identified in the Archbishop's condemnation, the condemnation of the social circle, whose standards and ways of life are alien to all the best instincts, as the condemnation of the establishment's alien to the upper class's instincts, rather than alien to the working class's instincts. The working class did not share all of the establishment's instincts about the appropriate woman for the king. The establishment's instincts about the appropriate woman included the specifically aristocratic formation and the specifically English background and the specifically unblemished marital history. The working class's instincts were not organized around the specifically aristocratic formation in the form that the establishment's instincts were organized around it. But the working class was also not uniformly sympathetic. The working class had its own version of the moral standards about the marriage and the divorce that the Archbishop's broadcast had been organized around deploying in the religious register. The divorce in the working class of 1936 was not the freely available option that the subsequent decades would produce as the available option. The divorce was the scandal. The twice-divorced American woman was the scandal in the working class's available register as well as in the Archbishop's available register. The reaction was complex. The complexity was the complexity of the class-divided society receiving the account of the private life of the king in the form that the account produced the complexity. What the crisis revealed about Britain in 1936 was the specific quality of the British establishment's management of the inconvenient in the form that the management takes in the specific historical moment of the 1930s. The 1930s Britain was the Britain of the rising fascism and the appeasement and the specific geopolitical anxiety of the decade that was moving toward the war that the decade was moving toward. The 1930s Britain was also the Britain of the class structure and the Church of England and the specific constitutional arrangements that the abdication crisis had been testing in the form that the constitutional arrangements are tested when the head of the constitutional arrangements wants to do the thing the constitutional arrangements say he cannot do. The constitutional arrangements said he could not marry the twice-divorced woman. The constitutional arrangements were the Church of England's position on the remarriage and the advice of the Prime Minister and the Dominions and the Palace's legal counsel. The constitutional arrangements were the available management tools of the specific management. The management tools were deployed. The crisis was managed. The king abdicated. The management speed was the speed of the available management, when the available management is the management of the established institution's response to the specific crisis the established institution has identified as requiring the management. The crisis was identified in October 1936, when Baldwin was informed of the king's intention. The abdication was in December 1936, 2 months. The management of the most significant constitutional crisis of the 20th century was completed in 2 months. 2 months is the speed of the British establishment's management of the inconvenient when the inconvenient is the inconvenient that the management has the available tools for. The available tools were the Church's position, and the Prime Minister's advice, and the Dominion's consultation, and the Palace's legal counsel, and the Archbishop's broadcast, and the exile. The tools were deployed in 2 months. The crisis was managed. The exile was produced. What the crisis revealed about Britain in 1936 was also the specific character of the institution's relationship to its own productions. The institution had produced Edward. Edward had produced the crisis. The crisis had produced the management. The management had produced the exile. The exile had been the management of the institution's production in the form that the institution's management of its productions takes when the production has been identified as the problem. The production was the problem. The production had been produced by the institution. The institution managed the production as the problem rather than examining the institution's role in the production of the problem. This is the specific character of the British establishment's management of the inconvenient, the management of the symptom rather than the examination of the cause. The symptom was Edward's obsession and the Wallis relationship. The cause was the institution's formation of Edward in the conditions that had produced the obsession. The institution managed the symptom. The cause was not examined. The cause is still not examined in the available public account of the abdication crisis. The available public account is the account of the Wallis question and the abdication and the exile. The account of the institution's production of the Edward who required the Wallis is not the account that the available public account has organized itself around producing. The British press's self-censorship across the years before December 1936 was the most visible available expression of the specific character of the British establishment's management of the inconvenient in the 1936 form. The not reporting was the management. The management was the self-imposed constraint. The self-imposed constraint was the product of the bargain between the press and the palace, the bargain of the access in exchange for the managed account. The bargain had worked for years. The bargain had held. The foreign press had been publishing the Wallis account. The British press had been not reporting it. The information had been available to the people who had the access to the foreign press, and had not been available to the people who had only the access to the British press. The constitutional crisis converted the not reporting into the reporting in the specific form that the constitutional crisis converts the managed account into the available account, suddenly and completely in the 2 months between October and December 1936. The available account arrived. The public received it. The management was complete. She was in the French villa. The Archbishop was on the BBC. The former king was in Austria. The bargain had produced the 2 months. The 2 months had produced the abdication. The abdication had produced the exile. The exile had produced 35 years. Britain in 1936 was the Britain that produced the 2-month management of the crisis in the available institutional form. It was also the Britain that had spent years not reporting the available account while the available account was being published in the American and European press. It was the Britain of the self-imposed constraint and the managed account and the bargain between the press and the palace and the Archbishop's condemnation and Betjeman's auld lang syne and the something must be done and the working class's complex reaction and the establishment's institutional interests and the 3 men whose institutional interests converged on the available instrument. The available instrument was Wallis Simpson. She was in the French villa listening to the Archbishop's broadcast and saying it was as though she had committed some horrible murder. She had not committed a murder. She had been the available instrument of the murder that the institution required to be committed on the problem that the institution's own production had generated as the available problem. The murder was the abdication. The instrument was Wallis. The murderers were the institution's management in the available form of Lang and Baldwin and Lascelles, and the constitutional machinery, and the 2 months and the exile. Britain in 1936 was the Britain that committed the murder in 2 months and managed the instrument into the exile for 35 years. The management continues. The exile's archives are still restricted in some dimensions. The Wallis question is still managed in the available form of the continuing disagreement between the biographers. The institution is still the institution. 90 years. The management continues. If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It genuinely keeps this channel going, and I read every single comment. Drop one below, telling me where in the world you are watching from.